Welcome back, dear friend. Tonight, we will be exploring the long, winding, and fascinating story of Canada, a land shaped by ice and rivers, by indigenous nations and European explorers, by fur traders, railways, and quiet revolutions. This is the tale of how one of the world's largest countries came to be, and how its people have shaped it across centuries. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you are watching and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes our stories are better than sleep, and other times they make you dream louder. It's time now to dim the lights, turn on a fan for some noise, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together, if we are to tell the story of Canada, we must begin not with kings and explorers, not with treaties or battles, but with the land itself. Because before there were borders, before there were names on a map, there was a vast northern wilderness, a place carved by time itself, shaped by forces far older than human memory. Imagine yourself standing on a rocky outcrop in the Canadian Shield. The air is still, crisp, filled with the quiet sound of wind moving through pines. Beneath your feet lies stone that is unimaginably ancient. Granite and gneiss formed billions of years ago, long before humans walked the earth. This shield stretches across nearly half the country, from the Arctic down into the heart of Quebec and Ontario, a foundation of rock that tells the oldest stories of this land. Geologists tell us that these rocks are some of the very first pieces of Earth's crust, formed when the planet was young. The Canadian Shield is like a great scar, a memory of ancient collisions between continents that no longer exist. When you run your hand across the surface of this stone, you are, in a way, touching the beginning of the earth itself. But the land we now call Canada has not always looked as it does today. For much of its history, it was covered in ice. Picture it. During the last ice age, beginning about 2.5 million years ago and reaching its height around 20,000 years ago, nearly the entire country was buried under vast ice sheets. Imagine glaciers as high as mountains, slowly grinding their way across the land, pressing down on the rock, carving valleys, deepening lakes, smoothing out the shield. The Laurentide ice sheet, the greatest of them, stretched over millions of square kilometers. It reached from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Arctic down into what is now the northern United States. To see Canada then would have been to see a frozen desert, not the lush forests or rolling prairies we know today, but a world of silence and cold, where ice was thicker than skyscrapers. And yet, it was these glaciers that gave Canada much of its character. As they moved, they scraped the land bare, leaving behind thousands upon thousands of lakes. This is why Canada today has more lakes than any other country in the world. From the great inland seas of the Great Lakes to the countless little ponds dotting the boreal forest, all of them are gifts of the ice. The glaciers also left behind fertile soils in some places, especially across the prairies, where the retreating ice deposited rich sediments that would one day make this region the breadbasket of a nation. As the ice melted, water poured across the land in torrents. Rivers found their paths, carving canyons and valleys, shaping landscapes we recognize today. The Great St. Lawrence River, which now carries ships from the Atlantic deep into the heart of North America, owes its form to this time. Niagara Falls, That thunderous cascade, visited by millions, is also the child of melting ice. But the land was not empty. Even before the last ice fully retreated, life began to creep back into Canada. In the warmer interludes of the Ice Age, mammoths roamed the grasslands, mastodons moved through forests, and giant beavers, creatures as large as black bears, swam in rivers and ponds. Saber-toothed cats stalked caribou, while herds of bison thundered across plains. Canada was a land of giants, a place where prehistoric life thrived under changing skies. When humans first arrived, and scholars debate the exact moment, they would have encountered a land still in transition. Most believe that small bands of people crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska thousands of years ago, during a time when sea levels were lower. These first peoples gradually spread south and east, following the retreat of the glaciers. For them, Canada was not a harsh wilderness, but a new home full of resources: rivers rich with fish, forests alive with game, and lands filled with berries and roots. These early inhabitants left traces of themselves: stone tools, campsites, fragments of bone, all whispering the story of how human life took root here. In places like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, archaeologists have found evidence suggesting humans lived there more than 20,000 years ago, making them some of the earliest known inhabitants of North America. As centuries passed, the land and its people began to shape one another. Vast forests spread across the Shield, dominated by spruce, pine, and birch. On the prairies, grasses grew tall, swaying under endless skies. Along the coasts, rich ecosystems developed. Cod filled the Atlantic waters, salmon surged through Pacific rivers, and seals dotted the icy Arctic seas. Each environment would one day give rise to unique cultures, but for now, in this earliest chapter of Canada's story, the land itself was the main actor. It was a canvas being prepared, a stage set for the drama of human history. The mountains, rivers, lakes, and plains we know today were slowly, steadily coming into being. Even now, when you stand in Canada's wilderness, by a quiet northern lake, or at the foot of a glacier in the Rockies, you can feel the weight of this deep time. The silence is not empty, it is filled with memory. It reminds us that Canada's story begins not with human hands, but with the patient work of stone, ice, and water. And so, when we speak of Canada, we must first speak of this ancient land, the foundation upon which all else rests. Without the Shield, without the ice, without the rivers and forests they created, there could be no story of peoples, no story of nations. The land is not just a backdrop, it is the first chapter, the quiet presence that has shaped every other chapter to come. When the ice finally retreated and the land revealed itself again, the first human footsteps left their impressions in the soft earth of what we now call Canada. These were not explorers in the European sense of the word, for there was no unknown to them. They were people finding home. They arrived in small family groups, carrying with them the knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge of how to follow the seasons, how to read the tracks of animals, how to fish in rivers, and how to live in balance with a changing environment. Over time, these scattered groups grew into nations, each shaped by the landscape around them. The immensity of Canada, with its Arctic tundra, its rolling prairies, its endless forests, and its rugged coasts, encouraged diversity. Life in the far north was vastly different from life in the Maritimes, or along the Pacific shore, or deep in the Great Lakes basin. And so, across millennia, distinct cultures, languages, and traditions flourished. The first peoples of Canada were not a single group, but many, woven into a tapestry of incredible richness. Each nation had its own ways of life, its own stories, its own relationship with the land, and yet they shared something fundamental: a deep respect for the natural world, an understanding that survival depended not on conquering the land, but on living in harmony with it. Along the Atlantic coast, in the region we now call the Maritimes, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and other Wabanaki peoples made their homes. They were people of the sea and the forest. The Atlantic gave them cod and shellfish, while the forests provided deer and berries. Their canoes skimmed across rivers and estuaries, allowing them to travel swiftly between camps. Seasonal rhythms shaped their lives. Summer spent fishing and gathering near the coasts. Winter spent hunting inland. Their stories, carried in oral traditions, spoke of Glooskap, a cultural hero who taught the people how to live, how to hunt, how to respect the world around them. In these stories, the line between the natural and the spiritual was never rigid. Every stone, tree, and river carried a spirit. To listen to the land was to hear the voices of ancestors and the guidance of creation itself. Further inland, around the fertile valleys of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, developed one of the most remarkable political systems in the pre-contact world. The Confederacy united several nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora, into a league bound by the great law of peace. This was more than an alliance. It was a sophisticated system of governance where decisions were made through consensus, where clan mothers held significant authority, and where the well-being of the whole was placed above individual gain. Long before European settlers dreamed of parliamentary democracy, the Haudenosaunee were practicing a form of government admired even by early American statesmen. Nearby, the Wendat, sometimes called the Huron, built villages of longhouses, communal dwellings that could hold entire, extended families. They cultivated the three sisters of agriculture: corn, beans, and squash, crops that sustained them alongside hunting and fishing. Their fields and towns were carefully managed, evidence of a settled and organized way of life that was anything but primitive. In the vast open lands of the prairies, life followed the rhythm of the bison, the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and others depended on these immense herds for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. Nothing was wasted. Hides became tipis, bones were fashioned into needles and weapons, sinew became cordage. The hunt itself was a communal act, requiring coordination, skill, and courage. Sometimes bison were driven into corrals or over cliffs in great numbers, a technique known as the buffalo jump. At Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, archaeologists have found evidence of this practice stretching back thousands of years. The open sky, the endless grass, the sound of hooves rolling like thunder across the plains. These were the elements that shaped prairie life, and woven into this life were spiritual traditions that tied the people to the natural cycles of the world: the sun dance, the medicine wheel, the sacred pipe. These were not mere rituals, but expressions of a worldview where everything was interconnected, where the circle was the symbol of life. On the western edge of the continent, where towering forests met the crashing waves of the Pacific, nations such as the Haida, the Tlingit, the Coast Salish, the Nuchanoth, and many others thrived. This was a land of abundance. Salmon filled the rivers in such numbers that they seemed endless, while the sea provided halibut, shellfish, and whales. The forests gave cedar, a tree that was not only a resource, but a sacred companion. From cedar, they built great longhouses and magnificent canoes, capable of navigating both rivers and open seas. They carved towering totem poles, each one a record of ancestry, history, and myth. These poles were not idols, but living stories, rising above the villages as reminders of identity and connection. The societies of the Pacific coast were highly stratified, with complex systems of rank and wealth. The potlatch, a ceremonial feast where leaders gave away gifts to display generosity and status, became the central institution of social life. Wealth was measured not in hoarded goods, but in the ability to give them away, to share and redistribute in ways that strengthened the community. And then there was the Arctic, a land of ice and snow where survival required extraordinary resilience. Here lived the Inuit, whose ancestors had adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. They built igloos of snow in winter and skin tents in summer. They hunted seals, walruses, and whales, using every part of the animal: meat for food, blubber for oil, hides for clothing. The Inuit developed technologies perfectly suited to their environment: the kayak, sleek and fast; the dog sled, capable of crossing immense distances; the ulu, a versatile knife used by women for every task. Their knowledge of weather, ice, and animal behavior was profound, built over generations of careful observation. Their stories, sung in drum dances and told under the northern lights, spoke of Sedna, the sea goddess who controlled the animals, and of spirits who moved through the ice and sky. In a place where daylight itself disappeared for months, storytelling was not just entertainment, but survival, a way to carry wisdom through the long polar night. Though separated by geography, these nations were not isolated. Trade routes crisscrossed the land long before Europeans set sail. Obsidian from the west, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the coasts, all found their way into distant regions. Ideas, stories, and goods flowed along these routes, linking peoples across vast distances. A bead of seashell found deep inland might tell the story of a 1,000-mile journey, passed hand to hand across generations. A copper ornament unearthed in the prairies might carry the memory of a miner who once dug near Lake Superior. These networks reveal a world that was dynamic, connected, and far more sophisticated than colonial accounts would later suggest. By the time Europeans first arrived on Canada's shores, the land was already fully inhabited, not in the sense of crowded cities, but in the sense of meaning. Every mountain had a story, every river had a name, every hunting ground had rules of respect. To live here was to be part of a web that tied people to place, to ancestors, to animals, to spirits. This world was not waiting to be discovered. It was already alive, already rich with history and tradition. The first peoples had created societies that fit seamlessly into the landscapes around them. They were not passive inhabitants, but active stewards, shaping forests with controlled burns, tending fishing weirs and rivers, cultivating crops in fertile valleys. It is important to remember this truth when we tell the story of Canada, that the first chapter is not European arrival, but the flourishing of indigenous nations who lived here for thousands of years, building cultures as enduring and diverse as the land itself. And as we drift further into the story tonight, we will carry their voices with us, for their presence is not confined to the past. It stretches into the present and into the future, part of Canada's ongoing tale, long before the vast waves of European settlers would come to the lands of Canada, long before the French or English would stake claims along its rivers and coasts. There were others who ventured across the North Atlantic, driven by curiosity, skill, and the restless pull of the unknown. These were the Norse, seafarers from the icy lands of Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, people whose lives were intertwined with the sea and the wind. They were navigators, fishermen, and explorers, accustomed to reading the stars, the waves, and the patterns of birds. Around the year 1000, a Norseman named Leif Erikson set out from Greenland, a land already harsh, a land already testing the limits of human endurance. Seeking new lands to the west, he traveled aboard long, slender ships designed to ride the high waves and skim shallow rivers, carrying with him not only supplies, but the hope and courage of his people. After many days at sea, braving storms and icy winds, he sighted land. It is believed to have been the northeastern shores of what we now call Newfoundland, a rocky, windswept coast that stretched far into the Atlantic. This was a land that had been shaped by ice and stone for thousands of years, still largely wild, still echoing with the songs of rivers and the cries of seabirds. Here, Leif and his companions established a small settlement, which modern archaeologists have located at Lance aux Meadows, a site that would become the earliest known European presence in North America. The settlement was modest, consisting of sod-covered buildings, simple but functional, designed to withstand the cold and the wind. The Norse planted gardens, hunted caribou, fished in the rivers, and gathered wood for fuel and construction. Life here was not easy. The winters were harsh, the summers brief, and the land strange and unfamiliar. Yet, for a time, they made it work, leaving behind traces of their presence that would endure for a millennium. These early Norse explorers were not seeking conquest in the way later Europeans would. They were driven by the same human instincts that had carried their ancestors across the seas for generations: curiosity, survival, and the hope of finding new places to settle or exploit for resources. They traded with the land, hunted the animals, and learned perhaps from the peoples who may have lived in the area before them. But their settlement was short-lived. For reasons still debated: harsh conditions, isolation, lack of reinforcements, or conflict with the land itself. The Norse eventually abandoned Newfoundland, leaving behind tools, remnants of buildings, and the quiet memory of their daring voyage. Though brief, their presence marked a profound moment in history, a bridge between the ancient world of Europe and the vast, wild continent that would one day become Canada. It is fascinating to imagine the Norse standing on the shore, looking out over the ocean, feeling the winds off the Atlantic, and sensing both the excitement and the loneliness of the lands that stretched before them. They may have glimpsed dense forests, glittering rivers, and mountains in the distance, unaware of the deep histories already unfolding among the first peoples of the land. Their stories, carried in the sagas, tell of strange lands, abundant resources, and the courage required to cross the Atlantic in wooden ships powered only by sail and human strength. These tales would later inspire other voyages, though they lay largely forgotten for centuries until archaeology confirmed that Europe had glimpsed North America long before Columbus. The arrival of the Norse was a quiet prelude, a fleeting encounter in the vastness of time, a reminder that Canada's history is layered, ancient, and full of the footsteps of those who dared to venture into the unknown. And so, even in their brief presence, they left a mark on the land and on memory, a whisper of the human spirit that would, centuries later, sweep across the continent with new explorers, new settlers, and new stories waiting to be told. As the Norse ships returned to Greenland, they carried with them tales of ice, of forests, of rivers and coasts unknown to their homeland, and of a world that was larger and wilder than any map could show. In this way, the first whispers of Canada entered the consciousness of the wider world, a land waiting patiently for the next chapter of its story to unfold. As the centuries passed after the Norse explorers had vanished from Newfoundland, the lands of what we now call Canada remained largely unknown to the wider world, hidden in the mists of the northern Atlantic and the vast forests that stretched inland. But by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the age of exploration had arrived in Europe. Sailors, merchants, and monarchs were driven by the desire for new trade routes, new lands, and new wealth. The promise of reaching Asia by sea to trade for spices, silks, and treasures unknown to Europe sent countless ships across dangerous oceans, and some of these voyages would touch the shores of Canada, though not always with the knowledge of what they had found. Among the earliest of these explorers was John Cabot, an Italian sailing under the English flag, who in 1497 ventured west across the Atlantic. His expedition made landfall somewhere along the eastern coast of North America, likely in what is now Newfoundland or Labrador. For Cabot and his crew, this was a land of dense forests, rushing rivers, and endless ocean vistas, a place rich with fish and other natural resources. To them, it was a new world, though it had been home to the first peoples for thousands of years. Cabot's voyage was brief, yet it opened the door for future English claims and established the first known contact between England and the North American continent. Not long after, French explorers began to arrive, drawn by similar ambitions. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed up the Gulf of St. Lawrence, seeking a route to the fabled riches of Asia. Instead, he discovered a vast and intricate river system, teeming with life and bordered by forests that seemed endless. Cartier encountered the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, whose villages dotted the riverbanks. He described their longhouses, their fields of corn, and the canoes that glided silently across the water. Though Cartier hoped to find gold and spices, he instead found a land abundant in other resources: fertile soil, rivers full of fish, and forests that could provide wood for building and trade. Cartier returned to France with stories of this new land, bringing back a few captives to learn the language, as well as samples of its soil and vegetation. The French crown saw the potential not only for trade, but also for establishing settlements and spreading Christianity. Over the decades that followed, Further French expeditions mapped more of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, explored the islands of Newfoundland, and ventured up the river that would one day give its name to the nation's largest city, Montreal. The age of exploration was a time of both wonder and danger. Ships were small, navigation tools were crude by modern standards, and storms could scatter a fleet or sink it entirely. Sailors faced the cold of the North Atlantic, the threat of scurvy from lack of fresh food, and the constant uncertainty of what lay beyond the horizon. Yet the lure of discovery, of adventure, and of potential riches kept them pressing onward. And while the European explorers were driven by ambition, they encountered lands that had long been inhabited, lands whose peoples had their own deep histories, their own networks of trade, and their own understanding of the world. These encounters were complex, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense, and often misunderstood by both sides. The French and English explorers brought with them not only their tools, maps, and weapons, but also new ideas, diseases, and cultural practices that would have lasting effects on the indigenous nations they met. The rivers and coasts of eastern Canada became the stage for this meeting of worlds. The St. Lawrence, the Atlantic harbors of Newfoundland, the islands of the Gulf, all became points of contact, trade, and eventual settlement. Fish, particularly cod, became a key resource, drawing Europeans seasonally to the rich waters off the Grand Banks. The age of exploration was also a time of mapping and naming. Europeans recorded what they saw, often ignoring or renaming places already known to the first peoples. Cartier named the St. Lawrence River, and in later decades, Samuel de Champlain would establish Quebec City, creating maps and records that would guide future settlers. Yet these maps only tell part of the story, for the land had already been meticulously known, charted, and named by those who had lived upon it for millennia. As we reflect on this period, it is important to imagine the sights and sounds of the early 16th century: ships rocking gently in bays, sailors mending sails, forests dense with life, rivers teeming with fish, and villages along the riverbanks filled with the sounds of people speaking, hunting, and trading. This was a world in motion, a meeting point between ancient lands and new ambitions, where the currents of rivers and the winds of the sea carried not just water and air, but the beginnings of a history that would shape the continent for centuries. The age of exploration in Canada was not a sudden conquest, but a gradual unfolding, a period of encounters and discoveries that would lay the foundations for settlement, trade, and cultural exchange. It was a time when the vast northern lands were glimpsed by those who would later seek to settle them, and when the stories of the first peoples intersected, however briefly, with the ambitions of distant kings and sailors. In this slow, quiet beginning, we see the first threads of what would eventually become a nation woven between the ice, the rivers, the forests, and the enduring presence of the people who had lived there long before the ships ever arrived. The land remained patient, vast, and alive, waiting for the next chapter in its story, while the explorers returned to Europe, carrying tales of a strange, wild land to inspire others, and leaving behind the quiet memory of a meeting between worlds that was only just beginning. In the early 17th century, as European interest in the lands of the North grew, one man became closely associated with the French presence in what we now call Canada. His name was Samuel de Champlain, a soldier navigator, and mapmaker, whose vision and determination would leave an indelible mark on the history of the continent. Born in France at the end of the 16th century, Champlain was drawn to the seas, to the promise of adventure, and to the possibilities of trade and settlement in distant lands. In 1603, he made his first voyage to North America, exploring the Gulf of St. Lawrence and learning from the indigenous peoples who lived along its shores. He observed their ways of life, their villages, their longhouses, and their trade networks. He listened to their stories and recorded their knowledge, recognizing the depth and sophistication of the societies he encountered. In 1608, Champlain returned to the St. Lawrence River with a more ambitious purpose: to establish a permanent French settlement. He chose a site on a rocky promontory overlooking the river, and there he founded Quebec City, a place that would become the heart of New France. The location was strategic, commanding the river and offering access to both inland trade routes and the Atlantic Ocean. Champlain's vision was not merely to build a trading post, but to create a community where French settlers could live, trade, and establish alliances with the indigenous peoples. He worked closely with the local nations, including the Wendat, forming partnerships based on mutual benefit. These alliances were essential for the fur trade, particularly the trade in beaver pelts, would become the economic foundation of New France. Champlain traveled extensively along the St. Lawrence and into the interior, exploring rivers, lakes, and forests, mapping the land with meticulous care. He described the forests, dense with pine and spruce, the rivers teeming with fish, the wildlife abundant and varied, from deer to moose to bears. He recorded his observations of indigenous customs, ceremonies, and languages, creating some of the earliest written accounts of life in North America from a European perspective. Life in New France was not easy. Settlers faced harsh winters, the isolation of remote villages, and the constant need for supplies from France. Yet under Champlain's leadership, the community endured and grew. He encouraged agriculture, built fortifications, and mediated disputes, both among the settlers and between European and indigenous groups. Champlain's understanding of diplomacy and navigation helped ensure that New France remained viable in a world where European powers were competing fiercely for control of the continent. The fur trade, in particular, required careful negotiation. Champlain and his allies established trading networks that reached deep into the forests and rivers, exchanging European goods for furs, which were highly prized in Europe. This trade created a web of economic and social relationships, connecting French settlers, indigenous peoples, and distant markets across the Atlantic. Champlain's explorations also extended beyond the St. Lawrence. He journeyed into the Great Lakes region, learning about the lands and peoples of what would later become Ontario, Michigan, and beyond. He documented his travels in detailed maps and journals, leaving a legacy that would guide future explorers, traders, and settlers. Throughout all of this, Champlain understood that survival and success in New France depended on cooperation with the First Peoples. He respected their knowledge of the land, their hunting techniques, and their understanding of rivers, forests, and climate. His ability to build alliances, to navigate both the physical landscape and the complex web of social relationships, was key to the endurance of the early colony. New France under Champlain was a place of adaptation, learning, and blending. Settlers brought European tools, crops, and techniques, while indigenous knowledge shaped the way they lived, traveled, and hunted. This exchange was not without tension, and later years would see conflicts and challenges. But in Champlain's time, there was a careful balance that allowed the colony to take root and flourish. Champlain's legacy extended beyond his lifetime. Quebec City became a center of administration, trade, and culture, and the networks he established would grow to include other settlements along the St. Lawrence, into Acadia, and deep into the interior. The French presence he nurtured shaped the language, law, and identity of the region for centuries to come. As we imagine the world Champlain navigated, we can picture the dense forests, the flowing rivers, the quiet villages of the Wendat and other nations, and the determination of a small group of settlers enduring the long winters, planting crops, building homes, and negotiating with allies and neighbors. Champlain's story is not one of conquest alone, but of exploration, alliance, and the attempt to create a lasting community in a new world. It is a story that speaks of courage, curiosity, and the patience required to live in a land both beautiful and unforgiving. In the quiet of the northern forests, along the banks of the St. Lawrence, and in the small settlement of Quebec, Champlain's vision began to take root, planting the seeds of New France and contributing to the unfolding story of Canada, a story that would continue to grow, intertwining the lives of many peoples and the vast, enduring land itself. As New France slowly established itself along the St. Lawrence River and into the interior, one aspect of the land captured the attention and imagination of both the settlers and the indigenous peoples alike: the fur trade. This trade would come to define much of Canada's early history, weaving together the lives of Europeans and First Peoples, shaping the landscape and creating networks that stretched across the continent. The wealth of fur-bearing animals in the forests and rivers was extraordinary. Beavers, whose thick pelts were highly prized in Europe for making felt hats, became the currency of this vast economic enterprise. In addition to beaver, other animals such as marten, otter, fox, and lynx provided furs, each with its own value and desirability. For Europeans, these pelts represented not just material goods, but status and wealth, and the trade in furs became the driving force behind exploration, settlement, and alliances. Early French traders, known as coureurs des bois, ventured deep into the forests, often traveling alone or in small groups, living among indigenous nations, learning their languages, and adopting their techniques for survival. These men were both traders and explorers, following rivers and portages for hundreds of kilometers, navigating the wilderness with skill and knowledge. They relied on the expertise of indigenous peoples who taught them how to track animals, build canoes, set traps, and survive in climates that could be harsh and unforgiving. Canoes became the essential tool of the fur trade, light, strong, and capable of navigating both rivers and lakes. They allowed traders to transport large quantities of furs and goods over long distances. Portages, where canoes were carried overland between waterways, connected the vast network of rivers that crisscrossed the continent, creating routes that linked the interior with the settlements along the St. Lawrence. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, and the Northwest Company, established later in the 18th century, became powerful empires within this trade. They set up trading posts at strategic locations, often near rivers and lakes, where indigenous peoples could bring furs to exchange for European goods. Metal tools, beads, textiles, and firearms were among the items exchanged, each of which had profound effects on the societies involved. These posts became centers not just of commerce, but of cultural exchange. Indigenous nations engaged in trade on their own terms, negotiating the value of goods, controlling the flow of resources, and establishing networks that extended far beyond local territories. The fur trade, in this sense, was not simply the Europeans imposing their will on the land, but a collaboration, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, between two very different worlds, each bringing its own knowledge, priorities, and customs. Life in the fur trade was arduous. Traders faced long journeys, dangerous waters, unpredictable weather, and the constant challenge of survival in remote and unfamiliar environments. Winter was particularly harsh, with snow and ice making travel difficult, and spring and summer bringing the challenge of mosquitoes, rapids, and swollen rivers. Yet the lure of furs, the opportunity for wealth and adventure, and the need to supply European markets drove men onward, deeper into the wilderness. Year after year, indigenous nations were not passive participants. They guided traders, taught them hunting techniques, and influenced the direction of exploration. In many cases, they controlled the trade routes, determined how furs would be gathered, and ensured that relationships were maintained through ceremonies, gift exchanges, and diplomacy. These interactions shaped the social and political landscape of the region. The fur trade also transformed the environment. Trails were worn into forests and along rivers. Trading posts became semi-permanent settlements, and certain animals were hunted extensively, sometimes affecting their populations. But it was a system built on reciprocity and adaptation, with indigenous knowledge guiding sustainable practices in many areas. Long before European notions of resource management were applied, as decades passed, the fur trade expanded westward into the Great Lakes, the prairies, and eventually into the vast interior, reaching Hudson Bay, the northern forests, and beyond. European ambitions for control and competition between trading companies drove exploration into new territories, while indigenous peoples continued to shape and influence the flow of commerce. The fur trade created a network that connected distant regions, linking rivers, lakes, and forests to the markets of Europe. It brought together peoples from vastly different worlds, fostering relationships, alliances, and sometimes conflicts. It also laid the groundwork for future settlements, exploration, and the eventual expansion of European powers into Canada's interior. In the quiet of the forests, along the rivers, and in the small trading posts, the fur trade was more than commerce. It was a way of life, a connection between humans and the land, and a meeting point of cultures. The sounds of paddles on water, the crackle of fires in winter camps, the careful negotiation over furs and goods, all became part of the rhythm of life in New France. And as the trade continued, it would shape not just the economy, but the culture, geography, and history of the land itself, leaving an enduring legacy that would echo through the centuries and become one of the defining chapters in the story of Canada. As European settlers and traders established themselves in New France, the complex relationships between indigenous nations and newcomers became increasingly important, shaping the social, political, and economic landscape of early Canada. The first peoples had been living on these lands for thousands of years, their societies rich with culture, law, and diplomacy, and the arrival of the French introduced new opportunities as well as challenges. Alliances were central to survival and prosperity. Many indigenous nations, recognizing the advantages of trade, formed partnerships with the French, providing furs and knowledge of the land in exchange for European goods such as metal tools, cloth, firearms, and other supplies. These alliances were not one-sided. Indigenous leaders negotiated carefully, ensuring that their communities benefited and that relationships were maintained through ceremonies, gift exchanges, and mutual respect. Among the most significant partnerships were those with the Wendat, Algonquin, and Innu nations, who played crucial roles in guiding French explorers through the forests, rivers, and lakes of the St. Lawrence Basin. Indigenous guides taught European settlers how to hunt, fish, and travel in a land that was both magnificent and challenging, sharing wisdom that had been passed down over generations. Yet these alliances were also entwined with conflict. Different nations had their own rivalries and histories of competition, and European involvement often intensified these struggles. The French often found themselves allied with one group against another, sometimes leading to wars that reshaped the balance of power in the region. One of the most well-known conflicts during this period involved the Iroquois Confederacy, who were powerful in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence regions. The Iroquois engaged in both trade and war, strategically navigating the new dynamics introduced by the French presence. The fur trade, while lucrative, also became a source of tension as competition for access to resources and trade routes heightened conflicts between nations and even between European powers. At the same time, the French worked to maintain alliances through diplomacy, negotiation, and sometimes intermarriage. Jesuit missionaries, for example, often acted as intermediaries, learning indigenous languages, recording customs, and attempting to mediate disputes. While their goal was the spread of Christianity, their presence also contributed to the broader network of communication and influence between nations. Life in this period was a delicate balance of cooperation and caution. Indigenous nations understood that the newcomers brought both opportunities and dangers, and European settlers quickly realized that survival depended on maintaining the trust and friendship of the local peoples. These relationships were reinforced by ceremonies, feasts, and shared labor, as well as by trade and strategic alliances that extended over vast distances. Warfare, when it occurred, was often a complex interplay of tradition, honor, and strategic necessity. Indigenous warriors brought knowledge of the land, mobility, and tactics that were unfamiliar to Europeans, while French settlers contributed firearms and military organization. Battles were fought not merely for territory, but for influence, trade control, and the protection of communities. Yet, even amidst conflict, there were moments of remarkable cooperation. Indigenous knowledge enabled Europeans to navigate rivers and lakes that would have otherwise remained impassable. Seasonal movements of hunting and fishing allowed for coordinated trade and survival strategies. Shared experiences of winter hardships and the challenges of remote living fostered mutual reliance and respect. The alliances and conflicts of this period had long-lasting effects. They shaped the political geography of New France, influenced patterns of settlement and trade, and left legacies that would continue to resonate in Canadian history. Nations that had been powerful in these centuries retained influence, and the stories of cooperation, negotiation, and conflict became part of the fabric of the land. As we imagine the forests, rivers, and villages of 17th century Canada, we can see a world alive with diplomacy, strategy, and human ingenuity. Canoes glide silently across the water. At dawn, emissaries carry messages between nations. Trading posts hum with activity, and warriors prepare for both ceremony and defense. In this rich tapestry of interaction, the Indigenous peoples of Canada were not passive observers of European expansion, but active participants, shaping outcomes, guiding exploration, and preserving their cultures through both adaptation and resistance. These relationships, intricate and dynamic, remind us that the history of Canada is not a simple tale of colonization, but a story of connection, negotiation, and the meeting of worlds, where survival and prosperity depended on understanding, trust, and respect. The land itself, with its rivers, forests, and lakes, provided the stage upon which these dramas unfolded, a living environment that required cooperation and resilience. In the quiet of the northern forests, along the winding rivers, and at the trading posts that dotted the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, the interplay of alliances and conflicts shaped the early centuries of Canada's history, leaving a legacy of relationships, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that continues to echo through time and adds depth to the story of this vast and enduring land. As New France grew beyond its first settlement at Quebec City, the French began to extend their reach along the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes and eventually across the interior of the continent, seeking fertile land, strategic trading posts, and alliances with indigenous nations. The expansion of settlements was a slow, deliberate process shaped by the geography of the land, the needs of the fur trade, and the challenges of climate. Rivers served as highways through forests that seemed endless, allowing explorers, traders, and settlers to move people, goods, and ideas across vast distances. Along these waterways, French settlements began to appear in key locations, often near indigenous communities that could provide guidance, protection, and access to trade networks. Ville Marie, founded in 1642 on the island of Montreal, became a center for settlement, religion, and commerce, intended to solidify France's claim to the region and provide a foothold for future expansion. The French sought to establish not just trading posts, but communities that could endure the harsh winters and sustain themselves through agriculture, hunting, and trade. Families arrived from France, bringing crops, livestock, and knowledge of European farming techniques. They planted wheat, peas, and vegetables, while also learning from indigenous peoples about local plants, medicinal herbs, and the best practices for hunting and fishing in the new environment. Expansion was not merely economic, it was also cultural and religious. Jesuit missionaries played a significant role, traveling alongside settlers and traders to teach, baptize, and convert indigenous peoples. They learned native languages, recorded traditions, and in doing so, preserved valuable knowledge of societies that had existed for centuries. These missionaries often lived in the same remote conditions as the settlers, enduring cold winters, traveling by canoe across frozen rivers, and surviving in the forests alongside the communities they served. Life in New France required resilience and adaptability. Settlements were small and vulnerable, dependent on supplies from France and the local environment. Winters could be brutal, with snow piling high, rivers freezing, and winds cutting across open plains. Settlers relied on wood for warmth, preserved food for survival, and knowledge of the land to endure. They learned from indigenous peoples how to build shelters, track game, and navigate rivers, creating a hybrid culture of European and local knowledge. Expansion also meant navigating relationships with indigenous nations. Trade alliances were crucial for the fur trade and for security against rival European powers or hostile groups. Diplomatic skills were necessary, as misunderstandings or broken promises could lead to conflict. The French often relied on indigenous allies to help protect settlements, guide expeditions, and participate in strategic campaigns against common enemies. Across the interior, forts and trading posts were established to secure access to fur-rich regions. These outposts were often modest structures of wood and stone, built to withstand attacks, store supplies, and serve as hubs for communication and commerce. The forts connected settlements with rivers and lakes, creating a network that allowed for the exchange of furs, food, and information over hundreds of kilometers. Agriculture, though limited by climate and soil, began to sustain the growing population. Settlers cultivated small fields near the settlements, while hunting and fishing supplemented their diet. They also developed roads, bridges, and small boats, enhancing the ability to move goods and people efficiently. The expansion of New France was not without challenges. Disease, harsh winters, and occasional conflicts with both indigenous groups and rival European powers tested the resilience of settlers. Yet, the communities persisted, driven by ambition, faith, and the desire to carve out a life in a land that was both beautiful and demanding. As years turned into decades, the settlements became more established, and the French presence solidified. Quebec City, Montreal, and smaller outposts became centers of governance, trade, and culture. Networks of forts and villages extended along the rivers and lakes, allowing France to maintain influence across the region. The expansion of New France also had long-term effects on the land and its people. Indigenous nations adapted to the presence of European settlers, incorporating new goods, technologies, and ideas into their societies, while also negotiating for autonomy and control over traditional territories. The interactions between French settlers and indigenous peoples created a complex tapestry of culture, trade, and diplomacy that would influence the development of Canada for centuries. In the quiet mornings along the St. Lawrence, when mist rises from the river and canoes glide silently past small settlements, it is possible to imagine the rhythm of life in this period: the exchange of furs, the planting of crops, the discussions between settlers and indigenous allies, and the careful navigation of a world filled with both opportunity and challenge. The expansion of New France was a story of endurance, adaptation, and human ingenuity, a chapter in Canada's history that reflects the intricate balance between people, land, and culture. The rivers and forests remained alive, shaping the movements of humans, the growth of settlements, and the unfolding of a story that would continue to span centuries as the foundations of a new society took hold amidst the vast and enduring wilderness of Canada. As New France expanded and its settlements grew along the St. Lawrence River and into the interior of the continent, another European power was quietly making its own claims to the lands of North America. The British, who had established colonies along the Atlantic coast to the south, were increasingly interested in extending their influence northward, seeking access to resources, trade, and strategic territory. This convergence of European ambitions set the stage for centuries of conflict, rivalry, and diplomacy as the French and British vied for control over the same vast lands, often drawing indigenous nations into their struggles, sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries. The conflicts were not sudden, they were gradual, building through decades of competition for trade routes, fishing grounds, and control over key settlements. The fur trade, in particular, became a central point of contention. French traders, deeply connected with indigenous networks, moved westward to secure furs from the interior, while British traders and settlers sought to establish their own trade posts and assert influence over the same regions. The rivers, lakes, and forests became theaters of both economic competition and military strategy, as each side sought to outmaneuver the other. Early skirmishes often took the form of raids on trading posts or disputes over alliances with indigenous nations. Indigenous groups played crucial roles, sometimes choosing to support the French, sometimes the British, based on their own strategic interests, historical rivalries, and the benefits offered by trade goods or military support. Alliances could shift over time, making the landscape of loyalty and conflict fluid and unpredictable. Larger conflicts eventually escalated into wars, drawing thousands into campaigns that spanned forests, rivers, and settlements. One of the most significant of these conflicts was the 7 Years' War, which in North America is often called the French and Indian War. It was a struggle not just between two European empires, but also among the diverse nations and peoples who inhabited the continent. Battles were fought over forts, rivers, and key passages, and the outcomes of these engagements determined the control of vast territories. The war required immense coordination and resilience. Soldiers, settlers, and indigenous warriors endured harsh winters, long marches through difficult terrain, and the constant threat of attack. Forts were built and besieged. Rivers were navigated under the pressure of pursuit or escape, and villages were often caught in the path of armies moving through the wilderness. Despite the dangers, both the French and the British pressed forward, motivated by ambition, duty, and the desire to expand their empires. Diplomacy remained as important as combat. Treaties were negotiated, alliances were forged and broken, and negotiations often determined the fate of entire regions. Indigenous leaders carefully weighed the benefits and risks of supporting one side or another, understanding that their decisions could affect the survival and prosperity of their communities. In the end, the conflicts between the French and British shaped the future of Canada in profound ways. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked a turning point, with France ceding much of its territory to Britain. New France as a political entity ceased to exist, but its cultural, linguistic, and social influences endured, interwoven with the presence of the British and the continued resilience of indigenous nations. The rivers and forests, once the highways of trade and movement for the French and their indigenous allies, now became the stage for British administration and settlement. Yet the legacy of these conflicts was not only political, it was human. Families lived and adapted through wars, villages were rebuilt, trade networks were reestablished, and cultural exchange continued amidst the shifting balance of power. The stories of bravery, negotiation, endurance, and adaptation became part of the memory of the land, echoing in the rhythms of daily life, the courses of rivers, and the quiet forests where history had unfolded. As we imagine this period, we can see forts perched on riverbanks, the movements of canoes laden with furs or soldiers, the tension of negotiations in village squares, and the resilience of those who navigated the turbulence of colonial competition. The conflicts between French and British colonies were more than battles. They were a complex interplay of strategy, diplomacy, survival, and culture, shaping not only the map, but the lives, relationships, and identities of the peoples who called these lands home. In the quiet evenings along the rivers, with the snow drifting gently on the ground, or the forest whispering in the wind, one can sense the echoes of this struggle, a reminder of the layers of history, endurance, and human connection that formed the foundations of what would eventually become Canada. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the Seven Years' War, Canada entered a new chapter under British rule, a period defined by both transition and adaptation. The French, who had long established settlements along the St. Lawrence River and in other regions, were now subject to a different empire, one with its own laws, governance, and ambitions. The British faced the challenge of administering a vast and culturally diverse territory where French settlers, indigenous nations, and new British immigrants all lived under shifting authorities. To provide structure and clarity to this new arrangement, the British Crown issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This document was not merely a legal formality, it was an attempt to establish order across the expansive lands of North America. The proclamation recognized indigenous land rights, reserving territories west of the Appalachian Mountains for First Nations and prohibiting private settlement there without formal treaties. It sought to prevent conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples, acknowledging that the cooperation of indigenous nations was essential for peace, trade, and stability. For French settlers, the Royal Proclamation marked a period of adjustment. British laws replaced French civil codes, though the Crown allowed for the practice of the Catholic faith and the continuation of some local customs, recognizing the importance of maintaining loyalty and social cohesion. Quebec became a focal point for administration, with officials navigating the delicate balance between enforcing British authority and respecting the traditions of long-established French communities. Indigenous nations, who had played a pivotal role in the fur trade and in colonial alliances, now faced new dynamics. The proclamation acknowledged their sovereignty over certain lands, yet the pressure of settlement, trade, and European expansion remained constant. Leaders engaged in negotiations, seeking to secure their territories, maintain their cultural practices, and adapt to the encroaching presence of British settlers. Life in this period required resilience, patience, and diplomacy. French settlers continued farming, hunting, and trading along the St. Lawrence, maintaining communities that were centuries old. British officials and immigrants brought new ideas, commerce, and governance structures, creating a blend of cultures and practices across the territory. Trade networks expanded under British oversight, linking settlements along rivers and lakes, while forts and trading posts ensured control over strategic locations and continued access to resources. The proclamation also set the stage for westward exploration and eventual settlement, providing guidelines for the future expansion of colonies, while emphasizing the need for treaties with indigenous nations. This approach reflected both pragmatism and recognition of the enduring presence and power of First Peoples, whose knowledge of the land and strategic alliances remained invaluable. In towns and villages, along rivers and in forests, the rhythms of life continued. Families planted crops, canoes carried goods along winding waterways, and communities navigated the changing political and cultural landscape. Schools, churches, and civic structures gradually developed under British guidance, blending European practices with local traditions. The transition from French to British rule was not without tension. Differences in language, law, religion, and custom created moments of friction, while occasional disputes over land and resources tested the limits of diplomacy and negotiation. Yet, over time, accommodations emerged, blending continuity and change in ways that would define the evolving identity of the territory. In the quiet mornings along the St. Lawrence, when the mist rises off the river and the forest remains still, it is possible to imagine the settlers and indigenous peoples living within this new framework, negotiating, trading, teaching, and adapting to the realities of a land now under British authority. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was more than a legal document. It was a marker of transition, a recognition of rights and responsibilities, and a blueprint for coexistence, however imperfect, in a diverse and vast land. This period of British rule laid the foundation for the next stages of Canadian history, shaping governance, trade, settlement patterns, and relationships between communities. It was a time of adjustment and endurance, where the legacies of French settlement, indigenous sovereignty, and European ambitions intertwined, setting the stage for the continuing story of Canada, a story written across rivers, forests, and settlements, echoing through centuries and carrying the voices of those who lived, adapted, and persevered on this enduring land. As the late 18th century unfolded, a new wave of events to the south would ripple into the lands of Canada, changing its population, economy, and politics in ways that would resonate for decades. The American Revolution, which began in 1775 as the 13 colonies sought independence from British rule, created both fear and opportunity for the territories that now comprise modern Canada. While the revolution raged, many Loyalists, those who remained faithful to the British Crown, faced persecution, property confiscation, and danger in the rebelling colonies. Seeking safety, they looked northward to the lands still under British control, traveling long distances in harsh conditions, often by foot, wagon, or boat, bringing with them families, possessions, and the hope of a new beginning. These Loyalists settled in areas that would become Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, significantly increasing the population and altering the cultural landscape. Their arrival introduced new farming practices, trades, and social structures, while also heightening the need for governance, law, and infrastructure to accommodate the growing communities. Indigenous nations, who had already navigated complex alliances with French and British powers, found themselves facing additional pressures. Loyalist settlement often encroached on traditional lands, prompting new negotiations, treaties, and at times, conflicts. Indigenous leaders sought to protect their territories, maintain trade relationships, and adapt to the shifting political realities while preserving their cultures, knowledge, and ways of life. Economically, the American Revolution disrupted trade networks and created new opportunities. The fur trade, still central to the Canadian economy, experienced shifts as traditional routes and alliances were affected by the conflict. At the same time, British authorities encouraged settlement and development in areas now vacated by fleeing or displaced populations, fostering the growth of farms, towns, and commercial hubs. This period also marked the emergence of a more distinctly Anglophone presence in regions that had previously been dominated by French settlers. Language, law, and religion became part of a complex mosaic as communities of loyalists integrated into the existing populations, balancing continuity with adaptation. Militarily, Canada became a strategic bastion for the British. The defense of Quebec and other key settlements required coordination, fortifications, and alliances with indigenous nations, many of whom provided crucial support. Battles along the northern frontier were limited but significant, illustrating the importance of maintaining control over the territories and ensuring loyalty to the crown. The American Revolution also had symbolic implications, demonstrating the fragility of European authority and the power of people to challenge distant governments. British officials and settlers in Canada observed the revolution closely, learning lessons about governance, defense, and community cohesion that would influence policies and practices for years to come. In daily life, the settlers, both new and established, navigated these changes with resilience. Families farmed, fished, and traded, while children learned the languages and customs of a diverse society. The rhythms of the land, from the freezing winters to the bountiful summers, dictated the pace of life, and communities adapted their routines to survive and prosper. As decades passed, the influx of loyalists and the effects of the American Revolution helped shape the political, cultural, and social foundations of Canada. Settlements grew into towns, governance structures evolved, and relationships with indigenous nations continued to be negotiated and redefined. The legacy of this period is seen in the enduring communities, legal systems, and cultural diversity that characterize Canada today. In the quiet evenings along the St. Lawrence, in the forests of Ontario, and along the coastlines of the Maritimes, one can imagine the movement of loyalist families arriving with hope and determination. The discussions of land, trade, and governance, and the careful balance of cooperation and adaptation that allowed these new communities to take root. The American Revolution was not fought primarily on Canadian soil, but its impact was profound, reshaping the land, the population, and the story of the people who lived there, creating new chapters in a history that continues to unfold, where endurance, resilience, and the careful negotiation of human and natural forces remained central to life on this enduring land. Following the influx of Loyalists and the continued expansion of settlements, the British government recognized the need to organize the growing population and address the diverse cultural, linguistic, and legal traditions in its Canadian territories. In 1791, the Constitutional Act was enacted, creating two separate provinces: Upper Canada, which was largely English-speaking and located in what is now Ontario, and Lower Canada, predominantly French-speaking and encompassing much of modern Quebec. This division was more than a simple administrative change. It reflected the desire to accommodate the distinct needs, laws, and customs of these communities while maintaining British control. Upper Canada was designed to provide land to Loyalists, encouraging settlement along fertile rivers and lakes. The British implemented English common law, established land grants, and sought to promote agricultural development, with families clearing forests, building homes, and planting crops to sustain themselves. Towns began to grow along key waterways, serving as centers of trade, governance, and community life. Roads, bridges, and small ports were gradually developed, connecting settlements and facilitating commerce. The natural landscape guided much of this expansion, with rivers serving as main thoroughfares, forests providing timber for construction and fuel, and the fertile soil offering the potential for prosperous farms. Meanwhile, Lower Canada preserved the civil law system inherited from the French, along with the Catholic faith, reflecting the cultural continuity of the French-speaking population. Settlers continued their agricultural practices, maintaining communities along the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries. Villages and towns were organized with careful attention to land use, farming patterns, and local governance, balancing the traditions of the past with the realities of British oversight. The division of the provinces also had political implications. Each colony had its own elected assembly and appointed governor, allowing for local decision-making while still under the authority of the Crown. This structure aimed to prevent tensions between the English-speaking and French-speaking populations, although disputes over land, representation, and authority would continue to challenge governance in both provinces. Indigenous nations continued to navigate these changes with strategic care. The creation of Upper and Lower Canada altered settlement patterns and land use, affecting traditional territories and prompting new negotiations and treaties. Indigenous leaders worked to protect their lands and maintain autonomy while adapting to the expanding presence of settlers and British authority. Economically, the provinces were interconnected through trade, agriculture, and natural resources. Fur trading networks persisted, while timber, fish, and agricultural products moved along rivers and lakes, linking communities and contributing to the growth of towns and markets. The Constitutional Act also influenced social and cultural life. Schools, churches, and community organizations began to take shape in both provinces, providing education, spiritual guidance, and social cohesion. Families worked together to cultivate the land, preserve traditions, and create resilient communities capable of enduring the harsh winters and variable climate. Daily life in Upper and Lower Canada involved a delicate balance between labor, survival, and community. Farmers tended fields, canoes carried goods along waterways, and families relied on both European tools and local knowledge of the land to navigate the challenges of life on the frontier. Trade and cooperation with indigenous nations remained vital, ensuring access to resources, guidance through difficult terrain, and the preservation of relationships that had been established over centuries. The Constitutional Act of 1791 laid the foundations for the political and social structures that would shape Canada's development. By recognizing the cultural, linguistic, and legal differences of the population, the Act sought to provide stability and continuity while encouraging growth and adaptation. Its impact is still visible today in the distinct identities, languages, and traditions that continue to define Ontario and Quebec. In the quiet of the Canadian landscape, along rivers that have carried canoes for centuries, through forests that shelter wildlife and human activity alike, one can imagine the rhythms of life in Upper and Lower Canada at the turn of the 19th century. Settlers building homes, planting crops, navigating rivers, negotiating with neighbors, and participating in assemblies that shaped governance. The Constitutional Act was more than a law. It was a framework for coexistence, growth, and adaptation, setting the stage for the complex, resilient, and culturally diverse nation that Canada would continue to become. A story written across rivers, forests, and settlements, echoing through generations and carried forward by the people who lived, endured, and shaped this enduring land. As the 19th century began, the young colonies of Upper and Lower Canada faced new challenges, both external and internal, as the echoes of global conflicts reached across the Atlantic. Among the most significant events of this period was the War of 1812, a conflict between the United States and the British Empire that would have lasting consequences for the development of Canada and the identity of its people. The war arose from tensions over trade restrictions, territorial ambitions, and the desire of the United States to expand northward into British-controlled lands. While battles raged in the American states, the northern territories, including Upper and Lower Canada, became critical theaters of conflict where local militias, Indigenous allies, and British regulars defended settlements, forts, and strategic waterways. The defense of Canada relied heavily on a combination of military skill, local knowledge, and the support of Indigenous nations. Leaders such as Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, played pivotal roles, guiding warriors and forming alliances with the British to resist American incursions. Indigenous peoples contributed not only to military campaigns, but also to the preservation of their lands and communities, navigating the delicate balance between European powers while maintaining their own strategic interests. Settlers in Upper and Lower Canada experienced the war directly. Towns and villages were threatened by raids. Rivers became pathways for troop movements, and fortifications were strengthened to withstand attacks. Families endured the uncertainty of conflict, often seeking refuge in the forests or in fortified settlements, while continuing to farm, trade, and maintain their communities under the stress of war. Key battles, including engagements along the Niagara frontier, the defense of Fort York, and the defense of Quebec, demonstrated both courage and resilience. Though the conflict involved armies trained in European tactics, much of the fighting relied on local knowledge of the terrain, rivers, and forests. Canoes carried supplies, scouts navigated hidden trails, and militias used their understanding of the land to gain advantage over their opponents. The war also influenced economic life. Trade was disrupted, transportation routes were threatened, and resources were redirected to support the defense effort. Communities adapted, relying on local production, cooperation, and ingenuity to sustain themselves. Despite these challenges, the war fostered a sense of unity and identity among settlers and indigenous allies who had defended the land together, creating bonds that would endure long after the final shots were fired. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 formally ended the War of 1812, restoring pre-war boundaries, but leaving a legacy far greater than mere territorial lines. The experience of defending Canada helped solidify a sense of loyalty, resilience, and shared purpose among its diverse inhabitants. Settlers recognized the importance of local militias, the value of alliances with indigenous nations, and the strategic significance of the rivers, lakes, and forests that crisscrossed the territory. Culturally, the war left its mark through stories of bravery, sacrifice, and endurance, which were recounted in communities and became part of the emerging narrative of Canadian identity. Indigenous nations, while facing continued pressure on their lands, demonstrated the power of alliances and strategic diplomacy. Their role in the war highlighted the importance of local knowledge, military skill, and the capacity to influence outcomes on a continent dominated by European powers. In daily life, the quiet that returned after the war allowed communities to rebuild, tend crops, repair homes, and re-establish trade networks. Forts and settlements that had been fortified for defense transitioned back to centers of commerce and administration, while rivers and lakes resumed their role as lifelines for travel, trade, and communication. The War of 1812 also set the stage for future development in Canada. Lessons learned in governance, defense, and community organization influenced decisions regarding settlements, infrastructure, and relations with both indigenous nations and the United States. The experience of war reinforced the importance of unity, negotiation, and resilience, principles that would guide the colonies as they navigated the remainder of the 19th century. In the quiet evenings along the shores of Lake Ontario or the banks of the St. Lawrence, one can imagine the echoes of the war, the movements of militia and warriors through forests, the vigilant watch from fortified settlements, and the determination of families to protect their homes. The War of 1812 was more than a series of battles. It was a defining moment in the development of Canada, shaping identity, alliances, and the understanding of what it meant to live in a land that was both vast and enduring, where human courage, cooperation, and adaptation would continue to shape history for generations to come. Following the turbulence of the War of 1812, the lands of Upper and Lower Canada began to see a period of growth and transformation, driven in large part by immigration and an expanding population. Settlers from the British Isles, particularly from Ireland and Scotland, arrived in significant numbers, seeking new opportunities, farmland, and the promise of a fresh start in a land that seemed vast, untamed, and full of possibility. These immigrants traveled across the Atlantic under difficult conditions, enduring weeks or even months at sea in cramped, challenging conditions, often arriving with little more than hope, resilience, and determination to build a new life. Upon arrival, they were met with a landscape both beautiful and demanding, rivers that flowed like arteries through dense forests, lakes that reflected the endless sky, and fields of fertile soil hidden beneath layers of forest and rock. Settlers cleared land, built homes, and planted crops, often relying on the guidance and labor of extended families and communities to establish themselves in unfamiliar territory. Population growth was not confined to European immigrants alone. The descendants of Loyalists, French settlers, and indigenous nations continued to contribute to the evolving demographic landscape, creating a tapestry of cultures, languages, and traditions that enriched the social fabric of Canada. Towns expanded along rivers, lakes, and transportation routes, serving as centers for trade, governance, education, and religion. Roads and canals were constructed to connect settlements, facilitating commerce and communication, while ports along the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes allowed goods, people, and ideas to move more freely. Economic activity diversified alongside population growth. Agriculture became increasingly organized and productive, with wheat, barley, and other crops forming the backbone of local economies. Livestock rearing and small-scale industry, such as milling, blacksmithing, and timber processing, developed to support both local communities and trade with distant markets. The fur trade, while still present, gradually became less dominant as agriculture and settlement expanded into the interior. Social and cultural life evolved alongside population growth. Schools were established to educate children. Churches became centers of worship and community life, and social organizations helped settlers maintain traditions, celebrate milestones, and support one another in times of difficulty. Communities adapted to the seasonal rhythms of the land, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for the harsh, long winters that tested endurance and ingenuity. Indigenous nations continued to navigate these changes, balancing the pressures of growing European settlements with the preservation of their lands, cultures, and governance. Treaties and agreements were negotiated to manage land use, trade, and relationships, even as the encroachment of settlement created ongoing challenges. Immigration also brought new ideas, technologies, and practices. European settlers introduced innovations in agriculture, architecture, and local governance while adapting to the realities of Canadian climate and geography. The interaction between incoming populations and the established communities contributed to a dynamic, evolving society where cultural exchange, adaptation, and resilience were essential for survival and prosperity. The growth of population in the 19th century also laid the foundations for future political, social, and economic development. With more people came greater demands for representation, infrastructure, and public services. Towns grew into cities, roads became more sophisticated, and trade networks expanded, linking communities and regions in ways that would continue to shape the emerging nation. In the quiet of the northern forests, along the meandering rivers, and across fertile plains, one can imagine the lives of these settlers and their families, clearing land with hand tools, planting crops in carefully tended fields, building homes from timber and stone, and traveling in small boats or along rough roads to trade goods or visit neighbors. The rhythm of daily life was slow yet purposeful, guided by the seasons, the land, and the determination to create stability and prosperity in a new world. Immigration and population growth in the 19th century were more than numbers. They represented hope, adaptation, and the blending of cultures that would define Canada for generations. They transformed the land, enriched communities, and created the foundations for towns, cities, and regions that continue to thrive today. The rivers, forests, and fields witnessed the perseverance of families and communities, the evolution of social structures, and the expansion of human settlement, all contributing to a story of growth, resilience, and the enduring spirit of people living in harmony and challenge with the vast and beautiful Canadian landscape. In Lower Canada, the grievances were intertwined with cultural, linguistic, and religious identity. The French-speaking population, concentrated along the St. Lawrence River, resented the dominance of English-speaking elites known as the Chateau clique, who controlled commerce, politics, and the judiciary. Reformers sought more autonomy, responsible government, and the protection of French-Canadian language and culture. The rebellions were sparked by years of frustration and the desire for meaningful political reform. In Upper Canada, reformers, led by figures such as William Lyon Mackenzie, organized protests and eventually armed uprisings aimed at challenging the authority of the colonial administration. Battles were fought along roads, near settlements, and in strategic locations, though the uprisings were ultimately suppressed by Loyalist forces. In Lower Canada, leaders like Louis-Joseph Papineau rallied support for the Patriot movement, advocating for constitutional reform, fair representation, and the protection of French-Canadian rights. Armed conflicts erupted in villages, forests, and towns, with militias confronting British troops in a struggle that reflected both local grievances and broader social tensions. Daily life during this period was marked by uncertainty and disruption. Families lived with the threat of violence. Settlements were fortified or abandoned temporarily, and communities faced the challenge of sustaining themselves amid conflict. The forests, rivers, and rural landscapes became arenas of both resistance and negotiation, with locals navigating alliances, loyalties, and the practical realities of life under the stress of political unrest. Indigenous nations observed these uprisings with cautious attention, while some had long-standing relationships with the colonial authorities. They also understood that political upheaval could affect their lands, trade networks, and autonomy. Their role was primarily as observers and negotiators, maintaining communities and navigating changing circumstances with care. The aftermath of the rebellions was significant, even though the immediate uprisings were suppressed. British authorities recognized the need for reform to address grievances and prevent future unrest. Lord Durham was sent to investigate the causes, producing a report that recommended the unification of Upper and Lower Canada and the introduction of responsible government, a system in which executive authority would be accountable to elected representatives rather than appointed elites. This report and its recommendations laid the groundwork for significant political changes in the decades that followed, shaping the development of governance in Canada and moving the colonies toward a more democratic and representative system. Socially and culturally, the rebellions reinforced the importance of identity, language, and local participation in governance. They highlighted the challenges of balancing diverse communities, including English and French-speaking settlers, immigrants, and indigenous nations, within a shared political framework. Economically, the uprisings disrupted trade and agriculture temporarily, but they also prompted reforms that would eventually support more equitable growth, infrastructure development, and regional cooperation. In the quiet evenings after the conflicts, as communities rebuilt and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, settlers reflected on the lessons of the uprisings. Families repaired homes, farmers returned to their fields, and towns re-established markets and trade routes. The forests and rivers, silent witnesses to the clashes, continued to guide travel, trade, and daily life. The rebellions of 1837, 1838 were not merely episodes of conflict. They were catalysts for reflection, reform, and the gradual evolution of political life in Canada. They underscored the importance of representation, the value of negotiation, and the need to respect diverse identities and interests within a shared society. In imagining the landscapes of Upper and Lower Canada during this time, the rolling fields, dense forests, winding rivers, and small settlements, it is possible to sense the resilience of communities, the determination of reformers, and the quiet endurance of families navigating change. These uprisings became part of the larger story of Canada, a reminder that the path to a stable, representative, and just society often requires courage, reflection, and the careful balancing of tradition and reform, shaping the nation's character for generations to come. In the aftermath of the rebellions of 1837, 1838, the British government recognized that meaningful political reform was necessary to stabilize the colonies and address the frustrations that had erupted into violence. In 1841, the Union Act was enacted, merging Upper and Lower Canada into a single political entity called the Province of Canada, with two distinct regions, Canada West, formerly Upper Canada, and Canada East, formerly Lower Canada. This unification was intended to streamline governance, strengthen British control, and encourage political cooperation, though it also introduced new challenges as the two regions navigated differences in language, culture, law, and representation. The creation of the Province of Canada brought a new legislative structure. A single parliament was established, with elected representatives from both Canada East and Canada West, while an appointed governor retained significant executive authority. The balance of power was delicate, with each region striving to ensure its voice was heard, and political negotiations became a constant feature of life in the colony. Canada East retained French civil law and the Catholic faith, preserving much of its cultural and legal heritage, while Canada West operated under English common law and increasingly reflected British settlement patterns and institutions. This duality required careful negotiation, compromise, and understanding as representatives and leaders sought to reconcile regional interests, cultural traditions, and political priorities. Daily life continued to be shaped by the rhythms of the land, the economy, and the ongoing process of settlement. Farmers cleared forests, planted crops, and harvested grain, while towns grew along rivers and lakes, serving as hubs of commerce, education, and social life. Trade networks expanded, connecting communities, and small industries developed to process timber, grain, and other resources, providing employment and supporting local economies. Immigration played a continuing role in shaping the population. Settlers from Britain, Ireland, and other parts of Europe arrived, contributing new skills, traditions, and ideas while integrating into existing communities. The cultural mosaic of the province of Canada became increasingly diverse, requiring dialogue, compromise, and accommodation in both social and political spheres. Indigenous nations continued to navigate the evolving landscape with care. The union of Upper and Lower Canada altered settlement patterns, governance structures, and land use, affecting traditional territories. Indigenous leaders sought to maintain autonomy, protect lands, and engage with colonial authorities through treaties and negotiations, even as encroachment and the pressures of expansion continued to challenge their communities. Politically, the province of Canada experienced the tensions and complexities inherent in a system designed to unify distinct regions while maintaining British authority. Representatives debated issues such as responsible government, economic development, education, infrastructure, and the rights of minority communities. These debates often required patience, diplomacy, and strategic compromise, reflecting the challenges of balancing local interests with the broader needs of a united colony. In the quiet of the Canadian landscape, along rivers that had carried canoes for centuries, through forests teeming with wildlife, and across fertile plains where settlers tended their crops, life moved at a steady, purposeful rhythm. Families worked together to clear land, build homes, and cultivate communities, while political leaders negotiated and legislated, shaping the future of a colony that was both vast and diverse. The union of Upper and Lower Canada in 1841 was more than a legal and administrative act. It was a framework for negotiation, cooperation, and governance that would influence Canadian development for decades. It created a political laboratory where the challenges of cultural diversity, regional interests, and representative government could be addressed, and it laid the groundwork for future reforms, including responsible government and eventual confederation. In imagining the towns, rivers, and forests of this period, one can sense the quiet determination of settlers and leaders alike, navigating the complexities of a new political reality while continuing to live, work, and build communities in a land that demanded resilience, patience, and cooperation. The union of Upper and Lower Canada was a chapter in the evolving story of Canada, demonstrating the intricate balance of culture, politics, and human endeavor that would continue to define the nation for generations to come. As the province of Canada matured in the mid-19th century, the calls for political reform grew louder, reflecting the desire of settlers and local leaders for a government that was accountable to the people rather than solely to appointed governors or distant authorities in Britain. This movement toward responsible government became one of the defining political struggles of the period, reshaping governance and laying the foundations for modern Canadian democracy. Responsible government meant that the Executive Council or Cabinet would be responsible to the elected Legislative Assembly rather than to the appointed governor alone, creating a system in which leaders needed the confidence and support of representatives chosen by the people. Reformers in both Canada East and Canada West recognized that this change was essential to ensure fairness, accountability, and responsiveness to local needs. Leaders such as Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine in Canada East and Robert Baldwin in Canada West became prominent figures advocating for reform. They understood that cooperation between the two regions despite differences in language, law, and culture, was necessary to achieve political change. Through careful negotiation, compromise, and persistent advocacy, these leaders worked to establish a government that respected both regional interests and the principles of democratic representation. Achieving responsible government was not a simple task. The governor and the colonial administration were accustomed to exercising substantial power, and many elites resisted changes that would diminish their authority. Debates, petitions, and legislative maneuvers became part of the daily political landscape as reformers sought to educate the public, gain support, and gradually implement meaningful change. Indigenous nations observed these developments with interest, understanding that political reform could influence policies regarding land, trade, and relations with settlers. While the immediate focus was on representative governance for settler populations, broader discussions about rights, land, and autonomy often intersected with these reforms, highlighting the ongoing complexities of governance in a diverse and evolving society. Daily life in the colonies continued alongside political developments. Families tended farms, merchants conducted trade along rivers and roads, and communities organized schools, churches, and social activities. The rhythms of life were guided by the land, the seasons, and the interplay between settlement, agriculture, and emerging towns. Political reform became part of the social fabric as ordinary citizens learned about governance, participated in local elections, and engaged with debates about the future of their communities. The achievement of responsible government in the 1840s was a gradual process, culminating in the acceptance by the British Crown that the executive needed to act with the confidence of the elected assembly. This shift allowed for greater local control over policies, budgets, and legislation, and it demonstrated the capacity of colonial societies to influence governance through organized advocacy, negotiation, and cooperation. Economically, responsible government facilitated the development of infrastructure, trade, and commerce. Leaders were able to respond more effectively to local needs, supporting roads, canals, schools, and markets that connected communities and fostered growth. Socially, it encouraged greater participation by settlers in political life, fostering a sense of responsibility, civic engagement, and collective identity. Culturally, the reforms respected the distinctiveness of Canada East and Canada West, accommodating language, legal, and religious differences while promoting collaboration for the benefit of the unified colony. In the quiet evenings along the St. Lawrence, the Ottawa River, and the Great Lakes, one can imagine towns and villages where citizens discussed politics, families tended fields, and the rhythms of life intertwined with the slow but steady progress of democratic reform. Canoes carried goods along rivers, markets bustled with trade, and leaders met in chambers to debate policies that would shape the lives of thousands. Responsible government was more than a political concept. It was a framework for cooperation, accountability, and the careful balancing of diverse interests, demonstrating that governance could evolve through dialogue, persistence, and shared commitment. By the mid-19th century, the establishment of responsible government in Canada became a symbol of political maturity, stability, and adaptability, setting the stage for further reforms. The eventual Confederation and the development of a democratic society capable of addressing the needs of a complex and diverse population. It was a chapter in Canada's history that illustrated how patience, negotiation, and collaboration could transform governance, ensuring that the voices of settlers, communities, and regions were heard and respected, while continuing to respect the enduring presence of Indigenous nations and the land that sustained all who lived upon it. As the 19th century progressed, the province of Canada experienced remarkable economic growth, driven by agriculture, trade, and the development of new industries, with one of the most transformative forces being the expansion of railways. These railways, stretching across forests, rivers, and plains, became the lifelines of commerce, connecting remote settlements to towns, cities, and ports, enabling people, goods, and ideas to move with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Agriculture remained the foundation of the economy, with settlers cultivating wheat, barley, oats, and other crops, while livestock rearing provided meat, dairy, and leather for local consumption and trade. Farms expanded as new immigrants arrived, clearing land, planting fields, and establishing homesteads that would sustain generations. Trade, both local and international, flourished alongside agricultural growth. Rivers and lakes continued to serve as vital transportation routes, carrying timber, furs, grain, and manufactured goods. Towns and cities developed as centers of commerce, hosting markets, workshops, and small factories that processed local resources into goods for regional and overseas trade. The arrival of railways amplified these developments, shrinking distances and connecting regions that had previously seemed isolated. Tracks laid through forests and across rivers allowed farmers to send grain to urban markets, timber to mills and ports, and manufactured goods to settlements throughout the colonies. Towns grew along these railway lines, forming hubs of trade, communication, and culture, where settlers, merchants, and travelers converged. Railways also had a profound social impact. They enabled migration and settlement in more remote areas, allowing families to travel for work, education, or new opportunities. Postal services and newspapers expanded, facilitating communication and the exchange of ideas across vast distances. Communities that were once isolated found themselves connected, fostering economic cooperation and cultural exchange. Industrial development accompanied transportation growth. Mills, foundries, and workshops multiplied, producing tools, machinery, and household goods for both local use and export. Timber and mining industries grew in regions rich with natural resources, while urban centers expanded with banks, schools, churches, and civic buildings that reflected prosperity and progress. Indigenous nations observed these changes with care as the expansion of railways and settlement brought both opportunities and challenges. New transportation routes often intersected traditional territories, affecting hunting grounds, trade networks, and seasonal movements. Indigenous leaders negotiated with authorities and settlers, seeking to preserve land, culture, and autonomy amidst the rapidly transforming economic landscape. Daily life during this period was shaped by the rhythms of work, trade, and travel. Farmers rose with the sun to tend fields, merchants prepared goods for shipment, and railway workers maintained tracks and locomotives, ensuring the smooth flow of commerce. Communities adapted to the opportunities and demands created by railways, establishing inns, warehouses, and markets that catered to travelers and traders alike. The growth of economic infrastructure and rail networks laid the foundation for long-term prosperity, enabling regions to specialize in agriculture, industry, and trade, while creating a framework for future urbanization and connectivity. Cultural life benefited as well, with increased movement of people allowing for the exchange of ideas, traditions, and innovations across regions. The diversity of settlers, combined with the enduring presence of French and indigenous communities, contributed to a rich tapestry of language, art, and social life that continued to evolve alongside economic progress. In the quiet evenings along rivers that once carried canoes and the fields that had been cleared by generations of farmers, one can imagine the hum of industry, the distant whistle of trains, and the steady rhythm of life in growing towns. The forests, lakes, and plains provided both challenges and resources, shaping the development of settlements, trade, and transportation routes. Economic development and the rise of railways in 19th century Canada were more than technological or commercial achievements. They were transformative forces that connected communities, facilitated growth, and fostered social and cultural exchange. They exemplified human ingenuity, resilience, and the ability to adapt to and shape the environment, setting the stage for further expansion, urbanization, and the emergence of Canada as a nation capable of linking its vast and diverse lands through the movement of people, goods, and ideas. By the mid-19th century, the colonies of British North America had grown in population, infrastructure, and economic development, yet they remained politically fragmented, each governed separately with varying degrees of autonomy under British oversight. The challenges of governance, defense, trade, and expansion encouraged discussions about unifying these territories into a single, stronger political entity capable of managing internal affairs while maintaining ties to the British Empire. These discussions culminated in the Confederation of Canada in 1867, an event that marked a turning point in the history of the land and set the foundation for the nation we know today. The Confederation united four provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into the Dominion of Canada under the British North America Act, establishing a federal system of government that balanced regional autonomy with national authority. This framework created a central parliament responsible for matters of national importance, such as defense, trade, and foreign relations, while allowing provinces to manage local affairs, including education, property, and civil law. The formation of Confederation was motivated by practical, political, and economic considerations. Communication and transportation networks, such as railways, had linked distant settlements, fostering economic interdependence and a sense of shared purpose. Political reform movements and responsible government had demonstrated the benefits of a local participation, while ongoing tensions with the United States highlighted the need for a coordinated defense strategy. Economic integration promised to strengthen trade, resource management, and infrastructure development across provinces, providing stability and growth for the emerging nation. The creation of the Dominion of Canada also reflected a careful balancing of cultures, languages, and identities. Quebec retained its French civil law system and protection of the Catholic faith, ensuring continuity of culture and legal traditions. While Ontario operated under English common law, maritime provinces maintained local governance within the federal framework, contributing their voices and resources to the new dominion. Indigenous nations, while not fully included in the political processes of Confederation, continued to negotiate their presence, rights, and land use within this evolving landscape, adapting to the realities of settlement, governance, and legal frameworks imposed by colonial and federal authorities. Daily life in the years surrounding Confederation was shaped by these transformations. Settlers in farms and towns adjusted to the new political structure, while merchants, industrialists, and traders took advantage of opportunities created by greater economic integration. Railways and waterways continued to connect communities, enabling the movement of goods, people, and ideas across distances that had once seemed insurmountable. Education, civic participation, and cultural activities flourished as communities adapted to the changing political and social landscape. The impact of Confederation extended beyond politics and economics. It fostered a sense of identity, unity, and shared destiny among the diverse peoples of the new dominion. Canadians began to see themselves not just as settlers of separate colonies, but as part of a larger nation capable of shaping its own governance, defending its territory, and managing its resources collectively. In imagining the towns, rivers, and landscapes of 1867, one can sense the anticipation, hope, and determination of communities as they entered a new era. Farmers tended fields that were increasingly linked to national markets. Towns served as hubs for commerce and governance, and families reflected on the opportunities and responsibilities that Confederation would bring. The Dominion of Canada was born not merely from legislation, but from decades of settlement, struggle, negotiation, and cooperation, a culmination of social, economic, and political evolution that spanned centuries. Confederation represented a beginning as much as a culmination, providing the framework for expansion, inclusion of additional provinces and territories, and the development of a nation capable of navigating the challenges of geography, diversity, and governance. It was a story of patience, vision, and the ability to reconcile differences, balancing local traditions with national purpose. In the quiet of the Canadian landscape, along rivers that carried trade and communities, through forests that had witnessed generations of settlement and adaptation, one can imagine the unfolding of this new chapter, where hope, resilience, and cooperation created a nation poised to grow, adapt, and endure across time and distance. After the Confederation of 1867, Canada entered a period of expansion and growth, stretching its influence and settlement further westward across the vast plains, forests, and river valleys of the continent. The addition of new territories and the creation of provinces such as Manitoba, British Columbia, and Prince Edward Island reflected both the ambition and practical necessity of governing a land that spanned thousands of kilometers, encompassing diverse peoples, climates, and landscapes. The westward expansion was fueled by multiple factors: economic opportunity, population growth, and the desire to solidify sovereignty over territories that were increasingly open to settlement, trade, and resource development. Settlers, many of them immigrants from Europe, journeyed across rivers, plains, and mountain passes in search of farmland, employment, and a fresh start. These journeys were long and arduous, often requiring weeks of travel by wagon, canoe, or horseback, navigating challenging terrain, unpredictable weather, and the uncertainties of life in relatively undeveloped lands. Indigenous nations, who had lived on these lands for centuries, faced dramatic changes during this period. Treaties and agreements, often negotiated under pressure, attempted to manage settlement, land use, and resource rights. Yet the arrival of settlers and the expansion of railways and towns inevitably altered traditional ways of life. Indigenous leaders sought to protect their territories, culture, and autonomy while adapting to the social, political, and economic realities imposed by colonial and federal authorities. The development of railways played a crucial role in connecting East and West, making transportation of people, goods, and resources more efficient, and linking distant settlements with ports, towns, and cities. Railways facilitated commerce, migration, and communication, enabling communities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia to grow and thrive, even in areas previously considered remote or inaccessible. Agriculture expanded across the prairies, with settlers establishing farms, cultivating wheat, barley, and other crops, and raising livestock suited to the vast open plains. Small towns developed as commercial and social hubs, with markets, schools, churches, and civic buildings providing the infrastructure necessary for stable communities. Economic development extended beyond farming, encompassing mining, forestry, and trade in natural resources. Timber, minerals, and fur remained important, while emerging industries such as milling, transportation, and manufacturing grew to support both local needs and national markets. The expansion westward also created a need for governance structures, law enforcement, and political representation. New provinces and territories established legislatures, courts, and administrative systems that reflected both the diversity of settlers and the principles of federal governance set out at Confederation. Political leaders navigated the challenges of regional interests, population diversity, and the integration of indigenous perspectives into emerging policies. Cultural life evolved alongside settlement. Immigrant communities brought languages, traditions, and practices that blended with existing French, English, and indigenous cultures, creating a rich and complex social tapestry. Schools, churches, and community organizations supported education, spiritual life, and social cohesion, while fostering a sense of belonging and identity in these newly settled regions. Daily life for settlers was shaped by the rhythm of work, the demands of the land, and the seasons. Families cleared fields, built homes, and planted crops, while engaging with neighbors, traders, and local authorities to sustain their communities. Rivers and railways served as lifelines, connecting remote farms to markets, towns, and ports, and enabling the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture across great distances. The westward expansion and creation of new provinces were more than acts of settlement and governance. They were processes of adaptation, negotiation, and resilience. They required cooperation between settlers, indigenous nations, and federal authorities, balancing ambition with practicality and opportunity with respect for existing communities and natural resources. In imagining the sweeping plains, dense forests, and towering mountains of Western Canada, one can sense the determination, endurance, and hope of those who traveled into new lands, establishing farms, towns, and connections that would endure for generations. This expansion shaped Canada's identity, linking diverse regions, cultures, and economies into a growing nation, while highlighting the ongoing importance of negotiation, adaptation, and resilience in the face of a vast and varied landscape. As Canada expanded westward and developed economically, the presence, rights, and experiences of Indigenous peoples became central to the unfolding story of the nation. Indigenous nations had inhabited these lands for thousands of years, cultivating complex societies, trade networks, and governance systems that were deeply connected to the land, rivers, and forests. The arrival of settlers, the expansion of railways, and the establishment of new provinces created profound challenges for Indigenous communities as traditional territories were increasingly claimed for farming, trade, and settlement. To address these changes, the Canadian government initiated a series of treaty negotiations aiming to formalize agreements over land use, resources, and coexistence. These treaties, often numbered and covering vast territories, were complex documents that attempted to balance the interests of settlers with recognition of Indigenous rights, though they were frequently misunderstood, contested, or implemented in ways that disadvantaged Indigenous communities. The process of treaty negotiation involved careful diplomacy, dialogue, and at times tension. Indigenous leaders brought knowledge of the land, cultural traditions, and strategic acumen to discussions with government representatives seeking to protect the well-being, autonomy, and cultural heritage of their peoples. Promises were made regarding land allocation, hunting and fishing rights, education, and support for transition to new economic realities. Though the implementation of these promises varied, and the effects of settlement often disrupted traditional ways of life, daily life for Indigenous communities during this period was a delicate balance of adaptation, resilience, and cultural preservation. Families continued to hunt, fish, and cultivate land according to traditional practices, while also engaging with settlers, traders, and government agents. Communities worked to maintain languages, ceremonies, and governance structures, even as the encroachment of settlement and the imposition of new laws and economic systems created pressures that were difficult to resist. The construction of railways and towns further altered landscapes and mobility. Sacred sites, hunting grounds, and seasonal migration routes were affected, requiring careful negotiation and, at times, relocation. Indigenous peoples adapted by developing new forms of economy, such as trade in agricultural products, crafts, and participation in emerging local markets, while maintaining spiritual and cultural practices tied to the land. Social, educational, and legal systems began to intersect with Indigenous communities through treaties, residential schools, and government policies. These interactions were complex and often challenging, as Indigenous peoples sought to protect autonomy while navigating the influence of European governance and cultural norms. Indigenous leaders played a central role, advocating for their communities, negotiating terms, and mediating between tradition and the pressures of colonial expansion. Despite these challenges, Indigenous nations demonstrated resilience, creativity, and determination, preserving languages, ceremonies, and governance structures that continue to shape Canadian society today. The treaty process and the interaction between Indigenous peoples and settlers also had long-term political implications. It established precedents for land rights, governance, and federal responsibilities, shaping policies and legal frameworks that continue to influence Canada's relationship with Indigenous nations. Economically, treaties facilitated settlement and development while attempting to provide Indigenous communities with resources, support, and recognition, though the results were mixed and often contested. Culturally, this period highlighted the importance of storytelling, memory, and negotiation as Indigenous peoples documented experiences, maintained oral histories, and continued to teach younger generations about the land, responsibilities, and values that had guided communities for centuries. In the quiet of forests, along rivers, and across the plains, one can imagine the endurance and adaptation of Indigenous communities during this era, leaders meeting with officials, families tending land and preparing for seasonal changes, and communities preserving rituals and knowledge amidst dramatic societal shifts. Indigenous peoples and treaty negotiations were central to the story of Canada's expansion and nation building, illustrating the complexities of coexistence, the importance of dialogue and respect, and the resilience of cultures deeply connected to the land. The legacy of this period is both enduring and evolving, shaping relationships, legal frameworks, and cultural understanding in ways that continue to resonate across Canada, a testament to the strength, adaptability, and enduring presence of Indigenous nations within a land that has been their home for millennia. As Canada continued to expand westward in the late 19th century, the need for a transcontinental railway became urgent, both for economic development and for unifying the growing Dominion. The Canadian Pacific Railway, often referred to simply as the CPR, was conceived as a monumental project to connect the eastern provinces with the far reaches of British Columbia, linking vast forests, prairies, mountains, and rivers, and creating a lifeline for trade, settlement, and national unity. The construction of the railway was an enormous undertaking, requiring immense labor, engineering ingenuity, and the coordination of resources across a continent. Workers, including many immigrants from China, Britain, and Europe, faced extreme conditions as they carved tracks through rugged mountains, blasted tunnels through rock, and built bridges over wide rivers. Life on the railway camps was challenging and often perilous, with long hours, harsh weather, and the constant threat of accidents. Yet, the determination and skill of these laborers transformed the Canadian landscape, creating infrastructure that would shape the nation for generations. The railway also had profound social and economic effects. Settlements sprang up along the tracks, providing homes, markets, and services for workers and future communities. Towns grew into cities as trade and commerce flourished, and farmers gained access to distant markets, enabling them to sell crops, livestock, and other products across the country. Railways allowed goods to move quickly, people to travel with relative ease, and ideas to circulate more freely, knitting together a geographically vast and culturally diverse nation. Indigenous nations, whose lands the railway crossed, were deeply affected by its construction. Traditional territories were disrupted, sacred sites were altered, and hunting and migration routes were impacted. Treaties and negotiations attempted to manage these changes, Though the impacts were often profound and long-lasting, indigenous communities adapted by participating in the labor force, trading goods, and finding ways to preserve cultural practices despite the encroachment of settlement and industry. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 was a moment of national significance. The railway symbolized the physical and political unification of Canada, linking coast to coast and making the vast distances of the continent traversable. It enabled migration to the western provinces, encouraged trade with international markets, and fostered a sense of connection and identity among the population. Daily life for settlers and workers was transformed by the railway. Farmers could ship grain and livestock to distant cities. Merchants could import and export goods more efficiently, and families could travel for work, education, and social purposes. Communities along the railway line experienced growth, with schools, churches, markets, and social institutions emerging to support residents and travelers alike. The CPR also influenced culture and storytelling, as the railway represented progress, opportunity, and the human capacity to shape the environment. Tales of labor, endurance, and adventure became part of the collective memory, inspiring future generations to imagine and inhabit the land in new ways. Economically, the railway underpinned the growth of industry, trade, and urbanization. Timber, minerals, and agricultural products moved more efficiently, while towns developed into commercial centers with banks, factories, and civic institutions. The CPR was a catalyst for economic integration, linking regions that had previously been isolated and enabling coordinated national development. In the quiet evenings along rivers, plains, and mountain valleys, one can imagine the construction of the railway, the sound of hammers and drills, the rhythm of tracks being laid, and the determination of workers who braved immense challenges to connect a nation. The Canadian Pacific Railway was more than a transportation system. It was a symbol of ambition, perseverance, and the capacity to unite diverse regions and peoples. Its creation demonstrated the interplay between human ingenuity, labor, and the vast natural landscape, shaping Canada into a connected and enduring nation. The CPR became an artery through which the life of the nation flowed, linking communities, economies, and cultures, and standing as a testament to the vision, resilience, and collaboration required to transform a vast land into a united and thriving countries. At the close of the 19th century, Canada's Western territories witnessed a dramatic transformation with the discovery of gold in the Klondike region, sparking a frenzy of migration, trade, and settlement that would leave a lasting imprint on the nation's history and identity. The Klondike Gold Rush, beginning in 1896, attracted thousands of prospectors from across Canada, the United States, and around the world, each driven by the promise of fortune and adventure in the rugged and remote Yukon Territory. The journey to the Klondike was long and arduous, traversing dense forests, frozen rivers, steep mountain passes, and treacherous trails. Travelers faced extreme cold, unpredictable weather, and the constant challenge of carrying supplies and equipment over immense distances, often relying on rivers, horses, sleds, and their own endurance to reach the goldfields. Indigenous nations, who had long inhabited the Yukon and northern regions, were profoundly affected by this sudden influx of outsiders. Their knowledge of the land rivers, and survival skills became essential for many prospectors, and indigenous guides often facilitated travel, trade, and navigation through the challenging terrain. At the same time, communities faced disruption, environmental changes, and pressures on traditional ways of life as new settlements, trade posts, and mining camps appeared across the region. The gold rush led to the rapid establishment of towns, supply depots, and transportation routes. Dawson City, located at the confluence of the Yukon and Klondike rivers, became the central hub for miners, merchants, and settlers, bustling with commerce, entertainment, and activity. General stores, saloons, hotels, and trading posts sprang up to meet the needs of a transient and diverse population, creating a unique social and cultural environment shaped by opportunity, challenge, and resilience. Economically, the Klondike Gold Rush had far-reaching consequences. While many prospectors did not strike it rich, the influx of people stimulated trade, transportation, and services across the region. Supplies such as food, clothing, tools, and mining equipment moved along rivers and trails, creating temporary booms in commerce that supported towns, railways, and ports further south. The development of mining techniques, infrastructure, and settlement patterns laid the groundwork for the future economic integration of the Western Territories into Canada's national economy. Socially and culturally, the gold rush brought together people from diverse backgrounds, languages, and cultures, creating communities that were temporary yet vibrant, resilient, and adaptive. Stories of endurance, ingenuity, and the search for fortune became part of local lore, capturing the imagination of Canadians and the world, and highlighting the adventurous spirit of those willing to endure hardship for the promise of opportunity. Indigenous peoples continued to navigate these changes with careful attention, balancing participation in trade and guidance with the preservation of culture, territory, and autonomy. Their resilience ensured that traditional practices, knowledge, and governance structures endured even amid rapid social and environmental change. The Klondike Gold Rush also influenced Canadian politics and sovereignty. The federal government, eager to assert control over the Northern Territories and regulate the goldfields, established administrative systems, law enforcement, and infrastructure, strengthening Canadian presence and governance in areas previously sparsely populated and loosely controlled. Daily life for prospectors, settlers, and indigenous communities was shaped by the rhythm of survival, work, and adaptation. Miners panned rivers, dug into frozen soil, and built shelters, while traders transported goods. Families tended small farms, and local guides assisted travelers through treacherous terrain. Communities developed informal systems of cooperation, exchange, and governance, reflecting both necessity and ingenuity in a challenging environment. In the quiet evenings, along the Yukon River and amidst snow-covered peaks, one can imagine the flicker of campfires, the distant sound of river currents, and the resilience of those who persevered through hardship, seeking fortune and building communities in a remote and demanding land. The Klondike Gold Rush was more than a pursuit of wealth. It was a catalyst for settlement, economic development, and cultural exchange, shaping the social and political landscape of Canada's Western Territories. It demonstrated human endurance, adaptability, and the interaction between opportunity, geography, and society, leaving a legacy of towns, infrastructure, and stories that continue to echo in Canadian memory. Through rivers, forests, and mountains, the Klondike Gold Rush became a symbol of ambition, exploration, and the determination to thrive in the face of adversity, adding a dynamic chapter to the unfolding narrative of Canada's growth and expansion. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Canada entered a period of profound transformation, marked by social change, economic growth, and evolving political structures. The population continued to expand, fueled by both natural growth and waves of immigration from Europe and other parts of the world. Cities grew rapidly as industrialization took hold, drawing people from rural areas and newcomers seeking employment in factories, mills, and ports. Urban centers like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver became hubs of commerce, culture, and social life, where the rhythms of modern life contrasted with the slower pace of farming communities and newly settled western towns. Agriculture continued to shape the Canadian economy, but industrialization introduced new patterns of work, trade, and economic organization. Factories produced textiles, machinery, and consumer goods, while transportation networks of railways, ports, and roads enabled the efficient movement of resources, products, and people across vast distances. Technological innovations, including electricity, telegraphy, and mechanized farming equipment, transformed daily life, increasing productivity and connecting Canadians to broader national and international networks. Socially, the early 20th century brought both opportunity and challenge. Immigrant communities enriched the cultural landscape, introducing languages, customs, and traditions that added to the diversity of Canadian society. At the same time, social tensions arose around issues of labor, integration, and inequality, as workers sought fair wages, safe working conditions, and representation in growing industrial economies. Labor movements began to organize strikes, negotiate for rights, and advocate for social reforms, laying the foundations for future improvements in workers' protections and civic participation. Indigenous nations continued to navigate the pressures of settlement, government policies, and cultural change. The federal government implemented measures aimed at assimilation, including residential schools, which profoundly affected Indigenous communities, disrupting traditional ways of life, language, and culture. Indigenous leaders and families, however, persisted in preserving knowledge, traditions, and governance systems, adapting to challenges while asserting rights and seeking recognition. Politically, Canada was gradually asserting greater autonomy from Britain. The Dominion's government handled domestic affairs with increasing independence while participating in international diplomacy and global affairs, reflecting its emerging status as a self-governing entity within the British Empire. Debates over representation, provincial rights, and national policy shaped legislative discussions, influencing areas such as immigration, trade, education, and infrastructure. Education and culture evolved alongside these changes. Schools expanded access for children, literacy increased, and institutions of higher learning grew in prominence. Literature, newspapers, music, and the arts reflected both local experiences and global influences, creating a rich and varied cultural landscape that connected Canadians to broader ideas while preserving distinct regional and national identities. Daily life for ordinary Canadians was shaped by the rhythm of work, family, and community. Farmers tended fields and livestock. Factory workers labored in urban centers, and families engaged in community activities, religious observances, and social gatherings that reinforced connections and shared values. Transportation improvements, including streetcars, trains, and steamboats, allowed people to travel farther for work, trade, and leisure, integrating regional economies and social networks in ways previously unimaginable. The early 20th century also witnessed moments of national pride and challenge. Canadians contributed to global conflicts, including the First World War, and faced the economic and social consequences of these engagements. Communities mobilized to support the war effort, while also coping with the disruptions to daily life, labor shortages, and the emotional toll of loss and sacrifice. Economically, the period was characterized by both growth and volatility. Industrial and agricultural production expanded, resource extraction intensified, and trade networks matured. At the same time, fluctuations in global markets, natural disasters, and demographic pressures required resilience, adaptability, and innovation from both individuals and communities. In the quiet evenings of towns, villages, and cities across Canada, one could imagine the rhythms of this transformative period. Factories humming with activity, schools filled with the sound of learning, families gathering after a day's work, and the distant whistle of a train connecting communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Canada, in the early 20th century, was a nation balancing tradition and modernity, local identity and national cohesion, opportunity and challenge. Social, economic, and political changes shaped the character of communities, the aspirations of citizens, and the capacity of the nation to grow, adapt, and endure. This period laid the foundations for the Canada that would navigate the rest of the century, fostering resilience, diversity, and a sense of shared purpose that would guide the country through both triumphs and trials, and continue to influence the lives of Canadians for generations to come. The first half of the 20th century was profoundly shaped by the global conflicts known as the First and Second World Wars, and Canada, as a growing and increasingly autonomous nation, played a significant role in both. During the First World War, which began in 1914, Canada entered the conflict as part of the British Empire, sending thousands of soldiers to fight in Europe. Men and women from across the country volunteered or were conscripted, traveling across oceans to distant battlefields where they endured harsh conditions, extreme weather, and the immense pressures of modern warfare. Daily life at home was transformed as communities supported the war effort through fundraising, rationing, and volunteering. Factories shifted production to supply military needs, farms increased output to feed troops, and women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, contributing to both the economy and social change. The war had a profound impact on national identity, as Canadians experienced both the horrors of conflict and the pride of contribution on the global stage. The sacrifices of soldiers, the resilience of families, and the unity of communities forged a deeper sense of shared purpose and nationhood. Following the armistice in 1918, Canada faced the challenge of reintegration and recovery. Soldiers returned home, often carrying physical and emotional scars, and society adjusted to post-war economic and social realities. The influenza pandemic of 1918 further compounded challenges, yet communities persisted, rebuilding lives, infrastructure, and social institutions. As the decades progressed, Canada, along with much of the world, faced the upheaval of the Second World War beginning in 1939. Once again, the nation mobilized resources, people, and industry to support the Allied cause. Canadian forces served in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, participating in critical battles and campaigns that shaped the course of history. The war effort extended beyond the battlefield. Canadian factories produced ships, aircraft, and munitions. Farmers supplied food for both domestic consumption and export, and citizens contributed through rationing, volunteer work, and support for military families. Socially, the war's accelerated change. Women continued to enter the workforce, taking roles in industry, administration, and services that had previously been reserved for men. Technological innovation, urbanization, and communication improvements altered daily life, creating new opportunities and reshaping social expectations. Indigenous peoples, immigrants, and minority communities also contributed to the war effort while navigating the ongoing complexities of rights, recognition, and integration within a society undergoing rapid transformation. Politically, both world wars reinforced Canada's evolving autonomy within the British Commonwealth. While allegiance to Britain remained important, Canada increasingly exercised independent decision-making in foreign policy, military engagement, and economic strategy. The wars accelerated legislative and governmental reforms, expanded social programs, and strengthened national unity in the face of global challenges. Economically, Canada experienced both growth and strain. Industrial production surged to meet wartime demands, resource extraction intensified, and technological innovation flourished. After each conflict, the country faced periods of adjustment, including reintegration of soldiers, transition to peacetime economies, and the management of social and infrastructure needs, all of which shaped the trajectory of the nation for decades to come. Cultural life was also influenced by wartime experiences. Literature, newspapers, films, and art reflected themes of sacrifice, resilience, and national identity, capturing both the horror and heroism of the period. Communities commemorated fallen soldiers, celebrated contributions on the home front, and fostered a shared memory that reinforced the sense of Canadian identity across diverse regions and populations. In the quiet of Canadian towns, villages, and cities, one can imagine the daily rhythms during these turbulent years. The hum of factories producing vital goods, families tending farms while waiting for letters from the front, schools and community centers adjusting to new social roles, and the ever-present anticipation and anxiety that accompanied global conflict. Canada, during the World Wars, was a nation tested by adversity, yet strengthened by resilience, cooperation, and shared purpose. The experiences of these conflicts shaped the country's economy, society, politics, and culture, leaving a legacy of courage, innovation, and national identity that continues to influence Canadians today. Through sacrifice, ingenuity, and determination, Canada emerged from both world wars as a more unified, independent, and mature nation, ready to navigate the challenges and opportunities of the modern world while honoring the experiences and memories of those who contributed to its growth and security. Following the end of the Second World War in 1945, Canada entered a period of profound transformation marked by economic growth, social change, and modernization that reshaped the nation in virtually every aspect of life. Soldiers returned home, bringing with them experiences, skills, and perspectives shaped by years of service abroad. Communities welcomed these individuals with celebrations, while also addressing the practical challenges of reintegration, including housing, employment, and healthcare. The federal and provincial governments introduced programs to support returning veterans, including education and training opportunities, loans for housing, and assistance in establishing careers, reflecting a broader commitment to social welfare and nation building. Economically, post war Canada experienced an unprecedented boom. Industrial production, which had been geared toward wartime needs, transitioned to consumer goods, housing, and infrastructure development. Factories expanded, new industries emerged, and technological innovations accelerated, transforming daily life and creating jobs across urban and rural areas. The expansion of transportation networks, including highways, railways, and air travel, connected regions more effectively, facilitating trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Cities grew rapidly as people migrated in search of opportunity, bringing diversity, talent, and energy to urban centers. Suburbs expanded. Housing developments spread across former farmlands, and shopping centers, schools, and hospitals multiplied to meet the needs of a modernizing population. Socially, Canada became more inclusive and dynamic. Immigration policies gradually evolved, welcoming newcomers from a wider range of countries, enriching the cultural fabric of communities, and contributing to economic and social growth. Women, whose participation in the workforce had expanded during the war, continued to engage in professional, industrial, and civic roles, reshaping social expectations and opportunities for future generations. Education became increasingly accessible, with expanding primary, secondary, and post-secondary institutions. Universities grew in size and reputation, research flourished, and literacy and educational attainment rose, reflecting the nation's investment in knowledge and human capital. Culturally, the post-war era fostered creativity and exchange. Literature, visual arts, music, and media reflected both local traditions and global influences, producing a vibrant cultural landscape. Canadians increasingly engaged with the broader world through travel, communications, and exposure to international trends, while maintaining distinct regional and national identities. Politically, the post-war period saw the evolution of Canada as an autonomous nation within the Commonwealth. Federal and provincial governments collaborated on infrastructure, social programs, and economic planning, while asserting Canadian perspectives in international affairs. Canada participated actively in organizations such as the United Nations and NATO, contributing to global security, development, and diplomacy, reflecting its growing stature and maturity on the world stage. Indigenous nations continued to navigate the pressures of modernization, urbanization, and government policy, while challenges persisted, including ongoing effects of residential schools and systemic inequities. Indigenous communities worked to preserve culture, language, and governance, asserting rights and seeking recognition within an evolving legal and social framework. Environmental awareness began to emerge as industrialization and urbanization expanded, prompting reflection on the sustainable use of Canada's vast natural resources, forests, waterways, and agricultural lands. The balance between development and conservation became an important consideration for policymakers, communities, and individuals alike. Daily life in post war Canada was characterized by optimism, opportunity, and the rhythms of modern living. Families built homes, attended schools, engaged in work and leisure, and participated in social and civic organizations. Communities thrived on a sense of progress, connection, and shared purpose, guided by the lessons of the past and the possibilities of the future. In imagining this era, one can picture bustling streets, busy factories, expanding suburbs, lively schools, and families enjoying the newfound comforts and opportunities of modern life. The post war period was a time of renewal, growth, and transformation, shaping Canada into a nation capable of balancing tradition and innovation, local identity and global engagement, opportunity and responsibility. Modernization touched every corner of the country, from the developing cities of Ontario and Quebec to the expanding communities of the Western provinces and the Northern territories, fostering resilience, connection, and prosperity. Post war Canada was not only rebuilding from conflict, but also redefining itself, laying the foundations for social programs, infrastructure, cultural vitality, and international presence that would define the country for decades to come. The era of modernization demonstrated Canada's capacity to adapt, grow, and thrive, creating a society that was economically vibrant, socially dynamic, and culturally rich, while remaining rooted in the diverse histories, landscapes, and communities that had shaped the nation from its earliest days. As the 20th century progressed toward its later decades, Canada experienced a period of remarkable social change, economic growth, and cultural evolution, building upon the foundations laid in the post war era while responding to new challenges and opportunities. Urbanization continued at a rapid pace as people migrated to cities in search of employment, education, and a higher standard of living. Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and other urban centers grew into dynamic hubs of commerce, culture, and innovation, reflecting the changing demographics and expanding opportunities of the nation. Economic growth was fueled by diversification and technological advancement. Industries such as manufacturing, energy, natural resources, and services expanded, providing employment and fostering innovation. Trade networks matured, both domestically and internationally, linking Canada to global markets and enabling the efficient exchange of goods, services, and ideas. Immigration policies evolved, welcoming newcomers from Europe, Asia, the Caribbean, and other regions, enriching the cultural mosaic of Canadian society and contributing to the economy, social life, and cultural expression. This period saw the rise of multiculturalism as a defining feature of national identity, encouraging communities to celebrate diverse languages, traditions, and religions while fostering social cohesion and mutual respect. Social change also included significant advances in civil rights, gender equality, and Indigenous recognition. Women increasingly entered professional, political, and academic spheres, challenging traditional roles and gaining expanded opportunities for participation in public and private life. Indigenous peoples continued to advocate for land rights, self-governance, and cultural preservation, achieving milestones in treaties, legal recognition, and political representation. Education expanded and diversified, with universities, colleges, and vocational institutions growing in size and scope, providing opportunities for research, professional development, and creative expression. Literacy, higher education enrollment, and access to specialized training all increased, shaping a society capable of innovation, adaptation, and thoughtful engagement with both national and global challenges. Politically, Canada strengthened its autonomy, participating as an active and independent member of the international community. The country engaged in peacekeeping, trade negotiations, and global diplomacy, reflecting its status as a mature nation capable of contributing to world affairs while safeguarding its own interests. Federal and provincial governments navigated complex economic, social, and environmental issues, balancing growth with sustainability and the needs of diverse populations. Culturally, Canada experienced a renaissance of expression and creativity. Literature, music, film, visual arts, and media reflected both local experiences and global influences, capturing stories of identity, migration, social change, and historical memory. Indigenous arts and traditions received greater recognition, contributing to a richer and more inclusive cultural landscape. Daily life in late 20th century Canada was shaped by both continuity and transformation. Families and communities engaged in work, education, recreation, and social activity, while technology and transportation enabled new forms of connection and convenience. Highways, public transit, telecommunications, and emerging digital tools allowed people to live, work, and interact across great distances with unprecedented ease. The late 20th century also saw periods of economic challenge, including recessions, shifts in global markets, and resource fluctuations, requiring adaptation, resilience, and strategic planning. Communities responded with innovation, policy reform, and collaborative approaches to problem solving, reflecting the nation's capacity to balance growth with social responsibility. In imagining this era, one can picture bustling urban streets, expanding suburbs, vibrant neighborhoods, workplaces filled with innovation, classrooms echoing with learning, and cultural events celebrating diversity and creativity. The nation thrived amidst change, integrating tradition with modernity, local identity with global engagement, and economic development with social progress. Canada, in the late 20th century, was a nation defined by growth, diversity, and resilience, building infrastructure, institutions, and cultural richness that would support future generations. The combination of economic opportunity, social advancement, and cultural evolution shaped a society capable of navigating the complexities of a rapidly changing world, while honoring the history, landscapes, and communities that had shaped it for centuries. This period was a testament to the nation's adaptability, vision, and capacity for collaboration, reflecting the ongoing journey of Canada as it moved toward the 21st century with confidence, diversity, and hope. As Canada moved into the 21st century, it faced both remarkable opportunities and complex challenges, continuing a journey of growth, innovation, and social evolution that built upon centuries of history. Modern Canada is a nation defined by its diversity, democratic values, and connection to both its past and its place in the global community. Population growth and immigration have continued to shape the social and cultural landscape, creating vibrant, multicultural communities that celebrate a wide range of languages, religions, traditions, and perspectives. Cities have expanded and modernized, with urban centers such as Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary becoming hubs for finance, technology, education, culture, and international trade. Technological advancement has transformed daily life, with digital communication, the internet, and social media connecting people across vast distances, reshaping commerce, education, and social interaction. Economically, Canada has developed a diversified economy balancing natural resources, manufacturing, technology, finance, and services, energy production, including oil, gas, hydroelectric power, and renewable sources, has played a major role in economic growth, while trade agreements and international partnerships have expanded markets for Canadian goods and services. Innovation, research, and education have driven progress in science, medicine, and technology, contributing to the global reputation of Canadian institutions and expertise. Socially and culturally, Canada continues to prioritize inclusion, equality, and human rights. Indigenous nations assert their rights and work toward reconciliation, land recognition, and cultural preservation, while governments and communities engage in dialogue to address historical injustices and build meaningful partnerships. Women, immigrants, and minority communities have expanded representation in political, economic, and cultural spheres, contributing to a more equitable and dynamic society. Environmental awareness and sustainability have become central to national priorities. Canada's vast forests, lakes, rivers, and Arctic territories are both treasured and vulnerable, prompting efforts to manage natural resources responsibly, address climate change, and protect ecosystems for future generations. Policies, research, and community initiatives aim to balance economic development with environmental stewardship, reflecting the nation's commitment to sustainable growth. Politically, Canada maintains a stable democracy with active participation at federal, provincial, and municipal levels. Citizens engage in elections, public debate, and civic life, shaping policies on healthcare, education, infrastructure, immigration, and national security. Canada's role in international affairs, including peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, and trade negotiations, reflects both its historical ties and its contemporary influence as a respected global partner. Daily life in modern Canada is a blend of tradition and innovation, community and technology, opportunity and challenge. Families navigate work, education, and recreation while balancing urban and rural experiences, cultural traditions, and contemporary lifestyles. Communities continue to celebrate festivals, arts, sports, and cultural expression, fostering connection and belonging. Challenges remain, including economic inequality, climate change, housing pressures, Indigenous reconciliation, and the need for social cohesion in an increasingly diverse society. Yet Canadians demonstrate resilience, adaptability, and a commitment to collaboration and fairness, guided by values that have evolved over centuries. In imagining Canada in the 21st century, one can picture bustling cities with interconnected transportation and communication networks, quiet rural landscapes where traditions continue, forests and rivers sustained by careful stewardship, and communities celebrating diversity while planning for a sustainable future. Modern Canada is a nation that honors its history, from Indigenous cultures and European settlement to Confederation and industrialization, while embracing innovation, multiculturalism, and global engagement. It reflects the accumulated experiences, lessons, and aspirations of generations, creating a society capable of adapting to challenges, seizing opportunities, and thriving in a complex and interconnected world. Canada today stands as a testament to centuries of growth, resilience, and collaboration, embodying the promise of diversity, democracy, and shared purpose, while continuing to evolve as a nation that balances history, culture, economy, and environment in pursuit of a harmonious and prosperous future. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of the entire history of Canada and a good night's sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.